Welcome. You have made it to the end of the day, and that matters. This is Bible Stories for Sleep, and tonight we are walking through Zacchaeus in the sycamore tree together. Scripture reminds us that the Lord gives rest to the weary, and that is exactly what this hour is for. If these stories are a comfort to you, tap subscribe so the next one is always close. Now slow your breathing, soften your shoulders, and let the story carry you. The morning air above the oasis of Jericho did not cool so much as it shifted, trading the chill of the Judean desert night for a heavy, breathless warmth that settled over the palm fronds before the sun had even fully cleared the eastern hills of Moab. Long before the first merchant unlatched a heavy wooden shutter in the lower market, the air smelled of sun-baked dust, dry river reeds, and the sharp, sticky sweetness of ripening fruit dropping from the ancient branches that canopied the southern road. In the high, shaded courtyard of the chief tax collector's estate, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, soothing splash of water in a shallow stone basin where a single copper pipe trickled a thin, cool vein from the mountain aqueduct. Tamar, whose quiet footsteps were as familiar to the flagstones as the shadows cast by the surrounding colonnade, moved with a practiced, measured grace. Her woolen tunic, undyed and coarse yet scrupulously clean, made no sound as she swept stray palm blossoms from the mosaic floor near the entrance to the inner chambers. She moved without haste, her dark eyes observant, noting the way the morning light struck the polished bronze rim of a large water amphora and fractured into a blinding star. To the outside world, this house was a fortress of untouchable power, a place where silver denarii were counted behind iron-bolted doors while the poor spat into the dust of the outer lane. But to Tamar, who had tended these cool corridors for 20 years, the house was merely a great, hollow vessel that held a very small, very lonely man. Inside the north-facing chamber, where the thick mud brick walls kept out the rising glare, Zacchaeus sat alone at a low cedar table. He did not look like a man who held the economic throat of the Jordan Valley in his thin, ink-stained fingers. Without his ceremonial outer mantle, the heavy purple-bordered wool that signaled to every passing merchant that he held a lucrative franchise from the Roman equestrian order, he appeared almost fragile. He was a man of remarkably short stature, a physical reality that had shadowed his entire existence, forcing him from his earliest boyhood to crane his neck, to leap for handholds, to measure the world from a vantage point just beneath the eye level of other men. To compensate, he had built a fortress of exactitude. Before him on the table lay a tall stack of thin papyrus scrolls, bound with faded leather thongs, and a ledger of bleached hide ruled in neat, crimson ink. With a small bone stylus, he traced a column of figures representing the barley tariffs levied at the Jordan crossing 3 days prior. His fingers were long and extraordinarily nimble, the nails neatly trimmed, but the skin of his knuckles was dry from the desert wind. Every stroke of the stylus was precise, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. Yet, despite the stillness of the room, there was a restless tension in the way his shoulders curved inward, as if he were perpetually bracing against a blow that never quite landed. Outside, the first distant murmurs of the waking city began to filter through the heavy cedar doors, the wooden screech of a cart axle turning without grease, the sharp bark of a village dog, the guttural shouts of camel drivers urging their beasts up the slope from Jericho's famous balsam groves. Zacchaeus paused, his stylus hovering a fraction of an inch above the hide. His dark, sharp-edged eyes, remarkably bright beneath a high, furrowed forehead, darted toward the eastern window. "The road is crowded earlier than usual today," he murmured, his voice surprisingly deep for a man of his small frame, possessing that resonant clarity peculiar to those who have spent a lifetime needing to be heard over the indifference of taller men. From the doorway, Tamar paused in her sweeping. She did not look directly at him. Protocol and a mutual, unspoken understanding dictated that she avoid meeting his gaze when the ledgers were open. "A caravan from Perea came through before dawn," Tamar said, her tone level and devoid of the servility common among household servants in the province. She had seen too many masters rise and fall, too many prefects come and go with the changing political winds of Caesarea. And the pilgrims. More of them every day now, heading up toward Jerusalem for the Passover feast. They camp by the prophet Elisha spring 3 deep. The outer market is already impassable. Zacchaeus let out a dry, breathy sound that might have been a laugh had it contained any amusement. He laid the stylus down in its carved wooden groove. "Pilgrims," he said, the word tasting faintly bitter on his tongue. "Men who carry empty purses and sing hymns about deliverance while they try to smuggle olive oil past the checkpoint without paying their 3% to Caesar. They look at me as if my shadow were unclean enough to rot the wheat in their sacks." He stood up, smoothing the front of his fine linen tunic, a garment dyed in Tyre, soft as silk and smelling faintly of cedar oil and expensive laundering. He walked to the window and looked out through the intricately carved wooden lattice that filtered the glaring sun into golden geometric patterns across the floor. From this second-story vantage point, he could see the fringe of the great road that ran straight through the heart of Jericho from east to west, connecting the mountain passes of Judea with the rich agricultural plains of Gilead. Even now, at mid-morning, the thoroughfare was a shifting, swirling river of humanity. There were Roman legionaries in polished iron greaves and red wool tunics, their leather sandals clicking rhythmically against the packed earth, Idumean traders leading pack mules laden with salt from the Dead Sea, ragged Judean peasants carrying baskets of green figs on their heads, and everywhere, the low, persistent murmur of a crowd whose collective mood was shifting from the dull fatigue of travel to a strange, electric anticipation. Zacchaeus knew this road. He knew every rut in its limestone bed, every bribe it had extracted from the weak, and every handful of silver it had delivered into his iron-bound chests. 10 years ago, when he had first outbid 3 other local notables for the chief tax collection rights of the Jericho district, he had believed that wealth was an adequate substitute for belonging. He had calculated the cost with the same cold clarity he applied to grain tariffs. Isolation was simply the tax one paid for invulnerability. If no man would look him in the eye without calculating how much he owed, then he would ensure that every man looked up to him with a mixture of fear and grudging awe. He had succeeded beyond measure. His estate was the envy of the municipal council. His villas, though few knew of his holdings outside the city walls, rivaled those of minor Roman magistrates in Caesarea. He could buy anything the ancient world had to offer, from Greek manuscripts written on the finest vellum to Egyptian wine aged in pitch-sealed amphorae. Yet, as he stood there by the lattice window, watching the bright motes of dust dance in the slanting rays of light, a profound, hollow weariness washed over him. It was a physical ache behind his ribs, an ancient emptiness that no ledger could balance and no coin could fill. It was the realization that after years of building walls higher and higher, the only person truly locked out of his life was himself. "Tamer," he said quietly, without turning around. "Master." The collection booth at the western gate. "Is Titus managing it this morning?" "He is," Tamer replied, stepping slightly further into the room, a broom resting against her shoulder. "Though he sent a runner an hour ago. He says the crowd near the Sycamore Grove is blocking the approach. People are abandoning their carts in the middle of the road. They aren't just traveling today, they're gathering." Zacchaeus frowned slightly. "Gathering for what?" "The governor is not due until the feast next week, and Pilate always enters by the northern garrison." "It's not the governor," Tamer said, her voice dropping a fraction, carrying a strange, almost hesitant weight that made Zacchaeus turn his head to look at her. For the first time, Tamer met his eyes, and there was something flickering in her dark gaze, something restless and unsettled, like the shadow of a bird passing over water. "Word came up from Gilgal last night," she continued, keeping her hands folded quietly over the handle of her broom. "The crowds aren't looking at the Roman road. They are following a teacher from Galilee. The one they call the Nazarene." Zacchaeus's brow furrowed deeper. He had heard the names, of course. In a border province like Judea, gossip moved faster than the desert wind, carried by merchants, soldiers, and runaway slaves. He had heard the wild, improbable stories whispered in the taverns and argued over in the temple porticos, stories of blind men seeing the sun for the first time, of fevers breaking at a single spoken word, of bread multiplied on a green hillside by the Sea of Galilee. As a pragmatist, a man who dealt in hard numbers and verifiable receipts, Zacchaeus had dismissed the tales as the superstitious foolishness of a desperate, occupied populace looking for a king to deliver them from Caesar's legions. "A rabbi," Zacchaeus said, a dry, dismissive note returning to his voice as he turned back toward the window. "Another itinerant preacher wandering through the province with a dozen ragged fishermen at his heels, telling people to forgive their debtors and give their cloaks to the deserving. Exactly what this province needs, more men who don't know how to balance a ledger." "Perhaps," Tamer said softly, her gaze drifting toward the open courtyard where the water still splashed into the stone basin. "And yet, the booth keepers at Gilgal abandoned their posts yesterday afternoon to go listen to him speak by the lake. Even the temple guard sent to question him came back empty-handed, saying no man ever spoke the way he does." Zacchaeus did not answer. He turned away from the window and walked back to the cedar table, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the papyrus scroll. He felt a sudden, inexplicable prickle of irritation, or was it curiosity, that he quickly forced down. He was a man of substance, a Roman official of rank, a master of coin and contract. He had no business with wandering Galilean prophets who offered a kingdom that could not be taxed or measured. And yet, as he stood there in the quiet room, the noise from the street seemed to swell, pressing against the thick walls like an incoming tide. "Prepare the accounts for the afternoon audit, Tamer," Zacchaeus said, his voice curt, signaling the end of the conversation. "And tell the cook to have the cold meats and dried dates ready for evening. I will be at the gate until the sun drops behind the hills." Tamer nodded once, her expression unreadable, and turned to resume her work in the outer corridor. Zacchaeus reached for his stylus, but his hand hesitated. Through the wooden lattice, above the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels and the shouting of camel drivers, a new sound drifted into the courtyard, a low, rhythmic swell of voices, not angry or contentious, but surging together like the sound of wind rushing through a grove of ancient trees before a sudden rain. Outside the high stucco walls of the estate, the street was already a living, breathing wall of humanity. The heat radiating off the sun-baked mud brick facades was intense, a shimmering wave that made the distant hills appear to dance in the blinding white glare. The air was thick with the dust kicked up by thousands of sandaled feet, a fine, powdery silt that clung to the sweaty skin of travelers and settled like a grey frost upon the leaves of the date palms that lined the thoroughfare. Every doorway, every stone ledge, every flat-roofed portico was choked with spectators. Men, women, children, merchants who had left their stalls untended, and beggars who had crawled out from the shadows of the city gates, all of them were pushing, straining, craning their necks toward the eastern bend of the road where the great Jericho highway wound its way down from the wilderness of Judea. At the center of this human river moved a compact, unhurried group of men in dust-stained woolen tunics. They were ordinary men in appearance, bronzed by the northern sun, travel-worn, their sandals caked with red clay. They walked not with the rigid discipline of Roman legionaries nor with the self-important strut of temple scribes, but with the easy, swinging stride of those who had walked hundreds of miles across hills and valleys, sleeping under the open sky. In the middle of them walked Jesus of Nazareth. He was not tall, nor was he adorned with any sign of office or wealth. He wore a seamless tunic of coarse homespun wool, bleached to a pale, dusty ivory by the sun, and over his shoulders hung a dark brown mantle. His dark hair fell naturally to his shoulders, lightly touched with the red dust of the Jericho road, and his beard was trimmed short. What arrested the eye, what caused the milling crowd to fall instantly silent in pockets and then erupt into a fresh wave of murmurs, was not his stature or his clothing, but his presence. He walked with an absolute, unshakable stillness amidst the chaos of the press. While those around him shouted questions, stretched out hands for a blessing, or jostled for a better view, he moved with a calm, deliberate grace, his dark eyes scanning the faces in the crowd not with the cold calculation of a magistrate or the calculating stare of a tax collector, but with a deep, consuming attentiveness. It was a gaze that seemed to see straight through the noise, the poverty, the religious pretensions, and the hidden shames of every soul he passed, meeting each person as if they were the only human being in the entire sun-baked world. "He's coming!" His passing the cistern, a boy shouted from the roof of a pottery shop, his bare legs kicking against the clay tiles as he pointed frantically toward the south. The crowd surged forward with a collective groan and heave of shoulders. People pressed against the walls of the houses, flattening themselves against the warm plaster to let the Nazarene and his disciples pass. A blind beggar sitting near the base of a stone pillar by the horse market began to cry out at the top of his lungs, his thin, reedy voice cutting through the din, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Several stern-faced pilgrims nearby hissed at him to be quiet, telling him not to bother the master with his noise, but the Nazarene stopped. He did not look annoyed or inconvenienced. He turned entirely toward the sound of the desperate voice, walked 2 paces out of his way through the dense crush, and reached down to take the blind man by the shoulder, speaking words that were instantly swallowed by the roar of the surrounding multitude, yet caused the beggar's weathered face to instantly crumple into an expression of radiant, disbelieving joy. 100 paces away, half hidden by the carved wooden column of a public portico, Zacchaeus stood watching. He had left his courtyard on the pretext of inspecting the Western Gate collection booth, drawn by an impulse he could neither fully understand nor resist. But now that he was here, caught at the outer fringe of the vast, shifting sea of bodies, he realized the impossibility of his situation. Zacchaeus was shorter than almost everyone in the dense wall of humanity that lined the street. Whenever he tried to look over the shoulder of a towering Idumean merchant or a broad-shouldered Judean farmer, his line of sight was instantly blocked by a wall of sun-browned wool, dusty cloaks, and raised arms. He took a quick, impatient step to his left, trying to find a gap between two gossiping women with market baskets, but they shifted carelessly, effectively boxing him in. He tried to peer between the legs of a group of young boys sitting on a low stone wall, but they were too busy craning their own necks to notice the chief tax collector standing furiously and invisibly beneath them. A sudden, sharp sting of humiliation, old, familiar, and bitterly cold, shot through Zacchaeus's chest. For all his silver, for all his imperial warrants, for all the power that made governors in Caesarea nod in his direction, here, in the open street, he was nothing. He was invisible. He was a non-person, deliberately squeezed out by the very crowd that depended on his mercy or cursed his name. They did not want him to see. They never wanted him to see. To them, men like Zacchaeus were creatures of the dark interior, to be avoided like a plague sore or cursed under the breath when the tax receipts were tallied. He felt the hot blood rush to his face, a sudden, frantic pulse beating in his temples. He had only wanted to see him, just once, with his own eyes, to look upon this wandering carpenter from Galilee who had set the entire province into such an inexplicable ferment. He wanted to weigh him, to measure him against the cynicism of a man who believed that everyone had a price and every virtue was a calculated hypocrisy. Yet here he was, blocked by a wall of backs, unable even to catch a glimpse of the hem of the teacher's garment over the bobbing sea of turbans and headscarves. His breathing came faster, shallow and hot in the heavy desert air. For a fleeting second, the old bitterness rose up to choke him, the bitter, defensive reflex of a man who had spent his life deciding that if the world would not respect him, it would at least fear him. He almost turned on his heel, almost spat into the dust and marched back to the cold, sterile safety of his marble floors and iron chests. Then his eye caught something. A few yards ahead, where the street narrowed slightly between two massive stone warehouses, stood a colossal sycamore fig tree. Its ancient trunk, thick and gnarled with age, bulged with centuries of growth, its grey bark deeply furrowed like the face of a desert nomad. The lower branches swept outward in a great, sprawling canopy, heavy with broad, heart-shaped leaves and clusters of small, green, unripened figs that scented the hot air with a rich, medicinal sweetness. The tree stood right at the edge of the property line, its massive roots lifting the stone pavers of the street into uneven ridges. Without pausing to calculate the cost, without caring what the passing merchants, the sneering pilgrims, or his own terrified dignity might say, Zacchaeus acted. He gathered the fine, expensive folds of his Tyrian linen tunic in both hands, bunching the soft fabric up around his knees to free his legs. He stepped toward the gnarled trunk of the sycamore, ignoring the startled gasp of a nearby camel driver who dropped his leading rope in sheer astonishment. Zacchaeus placed his soft, uncalloused hands against the rough, hot bark. He found a cleft between two thick, moss-rimmed roots, jammed the toe of his fine leather shoe into a narrow crevice, and hauled his small frame upward. For a man accustomed to the smooth marble floors of his villa and the cushioned comfort of a cedar chair, the ascent was an undignified, clumsy struggle. A sharp ridge of bark grazed his knuckles, drawing a tiny bead of bright crimson blood that soaked invisibly into the pale linen of his sleeve. His breath came in ragged, whistling gasps as his muscles strained under a weight they were rarely asked to bear. A shower of loose gray bark and dried beetle husks rained down upon his head and shoulders, dusting his carefully groomed hair with gritty soil. Below him, a voice rang out, harsh, mocking, and carrying clearly over the murmur of the street. "Look at the little vulture. The chief thief of Jericho is climbing a tree like a runaway slave." A ripple of cruel, derisive laughter spread through the knot of bystanders near the corner. Someone threw a small, dry pebble that bounced harmlessly off the thick leather of Zacchaeus's boot. Zacchaeus did not look down. He clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscles in his cheeks ached, his dark eyes fixed entirely upon the goal above. With a final, desperate heave of his arms, he hoisted his chest over a thick, horizontal branch that stretched out like an ancient wooden arm directly over the center of the dusty thoroughfare. He scrambled onto the broad limb, straddling it clumsily, his knees pressing into the rough, warm bark, his chest heaving as he sucked in the dry, fig-scented air. He reached out with both hands and steadied himself behind a dense screen of broad, fan-like leaves that shielded him from direct view while leaving a wide, perfect window straight down onto the central artery of the street below. He sat there in the leafy gloom of the great sycamore, breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his hand scratched and bleeding, his fine linen tunic stained with dark smudges of resin and dust. For a long moment, the noise of the world seemed to recede, muffled by the rustling canopy of leaves above him. Zacchaeus wiped his bleeding knuckles against his stained tunic, his chest still rising and falling in rapid succession. He looked down through the green screen of the sycamore boughs, peering out into the dazzling, sun-bleached glare of the Jericho road, waiting for the crowd to pass, waiting for the teacher to arrive beneath his feet. From his elevated refuge among the broad, velvety boughs of the sycamore tree, Zacchaeus could survey the entire length of the dusty avenue leading inward from the great stone gates of Jericho. The afternoon sun beat down with relentless, brassy intensity upon the ancient walls, radiating a shimmering wave of heat that blurred the horizon where the Judean wilderness met the green, palm-fringed oasis. Below him, the broad thoroughfare was choked with an undulating sea of humanity, pilgrims on their way up to Jerusalem, merchants hauling carts laden with fragrant spices and woven baskets of dates, and local townspeople drawn like iron filings to a lodestone by the swirling rumors of the approaching teacher from Galilee. The air was heavy and thick, saturated with the rich, earthy scent of crushed sycamore fig fruit that littered the packed earth beneath the branches, mingling with the sharp, acrid odors of sweat, camel leather, and roasting lamb fat from the nearby market stalls. It was a sensory tapestry of a typical bustling market day in the lowest city on earth, yet today the usual rhythm of commerce and petty disputes had been entirely eclipsed by a strange, electric anticipation. Zacchaeus shifted his weight on the sturdy branch, wincing slightly as a rough patch of bark scraped against his ribs through the fine layers of his imported Egyptian linen tunic. That tunic, dyed a deep and costly shade of Tyrian purple at the hem, was a badge of his immense office, yet at this moment it felt less like a garment of honor and more like a suffocating shroud. He was the chief tax collector of Jericho, a man whose very name was spat out in doorways across the district, a man who bought his commission from the Roman procurator and exacted a merciless toll from every merchant, farmer, and traveler who passed through the king's highway. Yet, for all his gold and silver, for all the secure iron lockboxes buried beneath the mosaic floors of his opulent courtyard house, he had never felt smaller, more vulnerable, or more profoundly alone than he did right now, hidden among the leaves. Just a few yards away, stationed beside the massive timber gates of the city wall, stood Simeon, the burly and perpetually scowling toll guard who answered directly to Zacchaeus. Simeon's broad shoulders were squared beneath a leather harness, and his heavy bronze collection box rested upon a sturdy stone pedestal. With hands like thick chunks of olive wood, Simeon scooped up a handful of copper and silver coins from a passing caravan merchant, dropping them one by one into the deep, echoing receptacle. The metallic clink of silver denarii dropping into the bronze box rang out sharply against the murmur of the crowd, a sound that usually brought a grim sense of satisfaction to Simeon's hardened face. But today, even the guard looked uneasy. Simeon's heavy brow was furrowed, his sharp eyes darting constantly through the swirling dust toward the open road outside the gates, watching the throngs of people who were abandoning their posts and trade just to catch a glimpse of a wandering carpenter who preached a strange, disquieting message of a kingdom not built on taxes or swords. Simeon muttered a coarse oath under his breath, shoving another heavy coin into the box with a sharp metallic clatter, wishing the disruption would simply pass and leave their profitable empire undisturbed. He had built his entire life on the solid bedrock of Roman law, imperial coin, and the unquestioned authority of his wealthy master. Change was dangerous, crowds were volatile, and this man from Nazareth represented an unpredictable variable that Simeon's pragmatic, cynical mind instinctively distrusted. Further back, pressed hard against the cool, sun-bleached stone of a whitewashed bakery wall, stood Abigail of Jericho. An elderly widow whose shawl had grown frayed at the edges through years of quiet hardship, Abigail clutched a woven basket containing a few withered onions and a handful of dried lentils. Her eyes, rheumy with age but burning with a deep, enduring fire of resentment, fixed themselves upon the toll booth and the glittering fringe of Zacchaeus' tunic visible through the lower branches of the sycamore. Abigail's heart was a knot of old, unheeded grief. Just 3 winters ago, when the frost had ruined her family's small olive grove on the northern slopes of the valley, she had fallen behind on her provincial assessments. Zacchaeus' men had come with measured rods and iron seals, seizing not only the remaining harvest but the very copper cooking pots her grandmother had passed down to her. They had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bitter debt that seemed to stretch out into eternity. She looked at the surging crowd around her, neighbors who had likewise wept over empty larders and forced sales, and she felt the collective pulse of the city's humiliation thrumming through the air. They had all suffered beneath the sleek, well-fed hand of the chief tax collector. They had whispered curses behind his back in the dim, narrow alleys of the lower quarters, praying for a day of reckoning, a day when the mighty would be brought low and the humble lifted up. And now, rumors had swept through the market like wildfire that this very Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher known for dining with outcasts, healing the broken, and speaking with an authority that made even the temple priests in Jerusalem tremble, was walking this very road. Abigail wanted justice. She wanted a sign that the God of her ancestors had not forgotten the widow and the orphan beneath the crushing heel of the empire and its local collaborators. From his leafy vantage point, Zacchaeus watched Abigail through a gap in the foliage, and for the first time in years, he truly saw her. He saw the tremble in her thin hands, the deep lines etched around her mouth by decades of meager meals and sleepless nights, and the profound, aching weariness in her posture. A sudden, cold weight settled in the pit of his stomach. He had told himself 1,000 times that he was merely doing a difficult job, that someone had to collect the revenues, that wealth was the only reliable shield against a hostile and unpredictable world. He had convinced himself that his isolation was a necessary price for security. Yet, looking down at Abigail, the rationalizations dissolved like morning mist under the burning sun. He realized with startling clarity that every silver coin in his treasure chest represented a fragment of someone else's life, a stolen meal, a broken trust. The murmuring of the crowd suddenly swelled into a distinct, rolling roar, rippling inward from the outer hills like the approach of a sudden tide. The dusty haze on the horizon parted slightly as a cluster of figures emerged into the glaring light. At their head walked a man with travel-worn sandals and a simple, seamless tunic covered in the pale grey dust of the Jericho road. He was surrounded by a tight cluster of dusty, exhausted disciples who occasionally turned to gently stem the rushing tide of eager onlookers pressing in from all sides. Zacchaeus stopped breathing. He pressed his palms flat against the rough wood of the sycamore branch, leaning forward until the leaves brushed his forehead. Jesus of Nazareth did not look like a revolutionary king, nor did he carry the austere, terrifying holiness of the high priest descending the marble steps of the temple. There was an astonishing ordinariness to his stride, combined with an overwhelming, luminous presence that seemed to draw the very air toward him. His face was weathered by the sun and wind of Galilee, his dark beard touched with dust, but his eyes, when he briefly raised them to scan the ancient stone gates of the city, possessed a depth and a piercing, tender attentiveness that seemed to look straight through the stone walls, straight through the cheering throngs, straight into the hidden corners of every human heart. The crowd surged forward with a renewed, frantic burst of energy. People shouted out names, pleading for healing, lifting crying children toward the teacher's outstretched hands, creating a wall of bodies so dense that the street below became an impassable barrier of bobbing heads, turbans, and raised arms. Zacchaeus, standing barely 5 feet tall even in his finely tooled leather sandals, strained on his toes from his branch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was entirely blocked from view. The towering shoulders of merchants, the tall staves of traveling Levites, and the sheer press of the multitude conspired to keep him invisible, relegated once again to his perpetual state of exclusion. For a fleeting second, the old, bitter instinct flared up within him, the urge to shout for Simeon and his guards to clear the street with their heavy batons, to force these insolent peasants to make way for the master of the town's wealth. He checked the impulse, the hot shame rising in his throat choking off the unspoken command. No, not today. Not for this man. Below, Simeon stiffened, resting his heavy hand on the wooden hilt of his short dagger as the crowd surged uncomfortably close to the toll booth. The burly guard glared at the approaching Galileans, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He had spent his life guarding silver from thieves. He did not intend to let a ragged mob trample his station now. Abigail, too, pressed herself tighter against the white plaster wall, her old bones aching from the tension, her eyes locked on the approaching figure of the teacher, wondering if he would even notice an old, forgotten woman amid the grand pageantry of his arrival. Then, something extraordinary happened. The surging, chaotic roar of the multitude seemed to dampen, subsiding into a hushed, collective intake of breath. Jesus stopped dead in his tracks, right at the base of the great sycamore tree. The sudden silence was absolute, save for the dry, papery rustle of the leaves overhead in the desert breeze. The disciples clustered around him, looking up in surprise as their master tilted his head backward, his gaze lifting past the dusty boughs, past the tangled green screen of foliage, straight up into the dappled shade where the chief tax collector of Jericho crouched in trembling isolation. Zacchaeus froze. It felt as though an invisible hand had reached up from the sun-baked earth and grasped his heart. Every shield he had spent a lifetime forging, his money, his grand house, his haughty title, his hardened exterior, shattered instantly under the weight of that steady, unblinking gaze. There was no condemnation in those eyes, no flash of righteous disgust at the sight of the city's most notorious sinner, no cold calculation of moral worth. Instead, there was a profound, startling warmth, an infinite, welcoming recognition that pierced through the layers of guilt and loneliness like sunlight breaking through a dark, storm-laden cloud. Jesus smiled, a gentle, luminous expression that crinkled the corners of his sun-kissed eyes, and spoke with a voice that carried clearly up through the branches, ringing with an intimacy that made it feel as though no one else existed on the entire earth. "Zacchaeus," he called out, his tone rich with affectionate familiarity, as if calling to a long-lost brother. "Hurry down, for I must stay at your house today." The words hung suspended in the heavy, perfumed air of the oasis. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding crowd. Heads whipped around in shock, disbelief, and sudden, fierce indignation. Murmurs of outrage erupted instantly from the lips of the pilgrims and townspeople alike. Abigail stared in stunned bewilderment, her frail hands dropping to her sides as the bitter resentment in her chest clashed violently with the bewildering reality unfolding before her eyes. He was choosing him? Of all the houses in Jericho, of all the humble, suffering, faithful poor who lined the streets, this holy teacher was inviting himself to the opulent, blood-money-funded courtyard of the chief extortionist. Simeon the toll guard stood transfixed, his jaw slackening beneath his heavy beard, his worldview tilting violently on its axis. His master, the feared, untouchable lord of the local treasury, was being addressed not with stones or curses, but with an invitation to sacred, intimate fellowship. Up in the tree, Zacchaeus felt a warm tear trace a clean path down his dust-stained cheek, cutting through the grime of his daily toil. The iron armor around his heart dissolved completely, leaving him undone, exposed, and utterly overwhelmed by an unmerited grace he had never dared to dream existed. With trembling limbs and a heart expanding beyond the physical bounds of his chest, Zacchaeus began to climb down from the sycamore tree, sliding hastily through the rough branches, ready to leave his old life behind in the dust and step forward into the dawn of a completely transformed world. The dust of the Jericho roadway settled in a fine, golden haze around the base of the ancient sycamore tree, catching the slanted afternoon rays that filtered through the broad, dusty leaves. Zacchaeus dropped from the final lower bough, his fine linen tunic catching briefly on a rough knot of bark before tearing with a sharp, soft whisper. He did not care. The expensive fabric, imported at great cost from the looms of Alexandria and tailored to project an aura of untouchable authority, now bore a smudge of grey sap and dirt across the hem. He landed lightly on his sandaled feet, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps, his heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat against his ribs. Around him, the multitude surged like a restless, living tide. The air was thick with the scent of crushed fig leaves, roasted cumin from a nearby street vendor's cart, and the pungent, unmistakable musk of hundreds of travelers who had walked for miles beneath the blazing Judean sun. Voices rose and fell in a chaotic roar of overlapping dialects. Aramaic shouted across Greek, Latin commands barked by off-duty Roman guards, and the high, piping calls of children darting between the legs of merchants. It was the familiar, noisy chaos of Jericho, a border city choked with wealth and desperation, but to Zacchaeus, the noise had suddenly lost its harsh edge. The jeers that had followed him up the trunk, the muttered curses of neighbors who wished him a swift fall, the bitter laughter of men whose debts he had mercilessly enforced, now seemed to wash over him like water against stone. He stood frozen for a single, suspended heartbeat, his sharp eyes scanning the shifting wall of bodies. Just yards away, the center of the commotion held firm. Jesus of Nazareth stood beside the dusty roots of the tree, having halted his forward progress with a deliberate, unhurried grace. The traveling teacher was dusty from the road, his simple cloak worn at the hem, yet he carried an air of quiet, immovable gravity that commanded the chaotic space around him. The disciples formed a protective, albeit bewildered, semicircle at his flanks. Peter wiped a sleeve across his sweating brow, his weathered face creased with a mixture of exhaustion and mild irritation, while Andrew muttered something under his breath, his eyes darting anxiously toward the Roman garrison stationed near the lower gate. They were accustomed to crowds, accustomed to the hungry sick and the curious theologians, but they were entirely unprepared for this abrupt, public detour. Zacchaeus saw the exact moment Jesus lifted his head. The teacher's eyes, luminous and steady, bypassed the outstretched hands of the elders, ignored the frantic pleas of the local Pharisees who pushed forward to demand his attention, and locked directly onto the small, dust-smudged tax collector standing alone in the clearing. There was no condemnation in that gaze, nor the cold, transactional calculation that Zacchaeus was so accustomed to reading in the faces of men. Instead, there was a profound, piercing recognition, as if Jesus had known the exact weight of every ledger Zacchaeus had ever falsified, every lonely evening spent counting silver in the dark of his pillared courtyard, and every quiet tear he had ever swallowed, and loved him completely in spite of it all. Zacchaeus, Jesus called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the low murmur of the astonished multitude. The sound of his own name, spoken without venom or mockery, sent a shiver racing down the spine of the chief tax collector. "Hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." A sudden, stunned silence seemed to ripple outward from that exact spot, freezing the crowd mid-motion. The metal clink of a coin dropping into a bronze collection box a few stalls away sounded unnaturally loud in the abrupt quiet. For the disciples, the words landed like a physical blow. Andrew stiffened, his jaw tightening as he exchanged a quick, disbelieving glance with John. This was not part of the plan. They were entering Jericho on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover, a time of holy ascent, a time when purity and public standing mattered most. To lodge in the house of a known traitor, a collaborator who grew fat on the misery of his own people, was an unthinkable political and spiritual miscalculation. It invited scandal, outrage, and immediate alienation from the very crowds they had come to save. "Master," Peter ventured quietly, stepping half a pace forward, his voice a low rumble of protective protest. "The hour is late, and the quarters at the inn are already secured. Surely we cannot." He stopped, silenced by a single, gentle gesture from Jesus, whose gaze never wavered from the small man standing beneath the tree. In the crowd, the initial shock gave way to an explosive wave of resentment. Abigail of Jericho, standing near the front with a weathered basket of dried herbs clutched tightly against her chest, felt a hot surge of bitter fury rise in her throat. Her knuckles turned white against the wicker. For 3 long years, she had watched her family's ancestral olive grove slip away, piece by cruel piece, to satisfy the impossible quotas levied by the Roman governor and enforced with chilling efficiency by the man now standing before them. Her husband had died with a broken heart and empty pockets, crushed beneath a mountain of tax liens that Zacchaeus had signed with a flourish of his silver-nibbed pen. "He is going to the sinner's house," a voice spat from the middle of the throng, dripping with acidic disbelief. The sentiment echoed instantly, multiplying like wildfire through the dense sea of humanity. "He is staying with a thief," another shouted, a merchant shaking a fist wrapped in stained wool. "A dog who sells his own blood to Caesar." The murmur swelled into an angry, unified roar of discontent. The dust kicked up by restless sandals hung thick in the air, catching the amber light of the late afternoon sun as the multitude pressed inward, a wall of living hostility that threatened to swallow the small clearing whole. They had cheered for the prophet from Galilee, had sung psalms of deliverance as he entered the gates, and now he was voluntarily walking into the den of the beast. It felt like a betrayal, a cruel joke played upon a weary populace that had dared to hope for a champion of the poor. Yet, despite the rising tide of public fury, Jesus did not flinch. He simply waited, his presence acting as an anchor in the brewing storm. Zacchaeus felt the full, crushing weight of the crowd's hatred pressing against him from every side. He saw the bitter tears welling in Abigail's eyes across the clearing, saw the open contempt carved into the faces of merchants he had ruined, saw the protective, tense posture of the Galilean disciples who viewed him as a contamination. In any other moment, this hatred would have caused him to retreat behind the high stone walls of his courtyard, to summon his armed guards, to wrap himself once more in the cold, unyielding armor of wealth and power. Instead, the armor slipped away, leaving him entirely vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, a fierce, burning courage took root. Zacchaeus stepped forward, breaking the distance between the sycamore tree and the Nazarene. He did not cower. He stood tall, lifting his chin despite his short stature, his eyes bright with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. The internal isolation that had defined his entire adult life, the grand, empty rooms of his mansion, the silent meals eaten alone at a table set for 10, the total absence of a single human being who loved him for anything other than his silver, evaporated in the warmth of that single, unmerited invitation. He raised his hands, palms open and empty, gesturing for silence with a dignity that surprised even himself. "Look, Lord," Zacchaeus spoke, his voice ringing out clear, steady, and resonant, cutting through the angry murmurs of the surrounding multitude with astonishing force. The words tumbled out not as a defense, but as a total surrender, an immediate, unprompted reckoning of a life laid completely bare. "Half of my goods I give to the poor." The murmurs died instantly. A collective intake of breath swept through the front ranks of the crowd. Half. Not a tithe, not a token offering to appease a guilty conscience, but half of everything he owned, his lands, his gold, his precious imports, the very accumulation of his lifelong greed, surrendered in a single breath. Zacchaeus turned his gaze toward the spot where Abigail stood, his eyes shining with a profound, aching humility. He saw the shock register on her lined face, saw the rigid stiffness of her shoulders begin to soften just a fraction as the magnitude of his words sank in. "And if I have defrauded anyone of anything," Zacchaeus continued, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, though his resolve remained absolute, "I restore it fourfold." Fourfold. The penalty demanded by ancient law for the most egregious thefts, a restitution so staggering that it threatened to strip the chief tax collector down to his very skin, leaving him as destitute as the men and women he had exploited. It was an economic impossibility, a financial self-annihilation that left the local scribes standing near the well completely speechless, their inkhorns forgotten in their belts. The disciples exchanged bewildered, wide-eyed glances. Peter's mouth parted slightly. The protective anger that had gripped him moments before dissolved into a profound, humbling awe. This was no ordinary sinner seeking a superficial blessing, this was a soul being violently, beautifully reborn right before their eyes. The social barriers that they had spent a lifetime erecting, the rigid lines dividing the pure from the impure, the righteous from the outcast, were not merely crossed, they were utterly obliterated in the dust of Jericho. Jesus smiled, a deep, radiant expression of pure joy that seemed to illuminate the deepening shadows of the afternoon. He stepped forward and placed a warm, steady hand upon Zacchaeus' shoulder, bridging the final inch between two worlds that had seemed forever irreconcilable. "Today salvation has come to this house," Jesus declared, his voice carrying warmth and restoration to every corner of the silent, spellbound marketplace, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. The hostility of the crowd did not vanish entirely. Old wounds do not heal in a single afternoon, and the bitterness of years cannot be washed away by a single speech. But the atmosphere shifted. The rigid wall of hatred softened, parting like the waters of an ancient river to allow a new path forward. Abigail lowered her basket, her gaze lingering on the chief tax collector with a complex, unreadable expression in which lingering pain wrestled with the first fragile shoots of astonished grace. Zacchaeus turned, side by side with the Nazarene, and began to walk toward his home. The heavy bronze gates of his courtyard, usually bolted shut against the world, stood wide open, inviting the dust, the noise, the disciples, and the very people he had wronged to step inside. the sun dipped lower over the Judean hills, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone-paved streets, while inside the heart of the once lonely tax collector, a brilliant, endless dawn had finally begun. The afternoon heat of Jericho still clung to the stone-paved courtyards and the whitewashed walls of the city, radiating a dry, terracotta warmth that rose from the earth like the breath of a kill. Yet, as Zacchaeus walked beside the Nazarene through those wide-open bronze gates, the heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed upon his chest for decades seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of steps that echoed against the flagstones. The commotion of the crowd, the murmurs of astonishment, the skeptical whispers of scribes who lingered near the threshold, and the soft, shuffling sandals of the disciples, followed them into the sanctuary of his home, but the noise no longer felt like a wall keeping him out. It felt, for the first time in his life, like the sound of the world finally letting him in. Zacchaeus glanced sideways, his keen eyes catching the profile of the man who walked at his shoulder. Jesus of Nazareth moved with an unhurried grace, his plain woolen garment smelling faintly of dust, wild hyssop, and the long road from Galilee. There was no trace of triumph in the teacher's bearing, no smug satisfaction at having pierced the armor of Jericho's most despised citizen. Instead, there was a profound, steady attentiveness, as if the entire weight of the universe had narrowed down to this single courtyard, this single soul, and this quiet threshold. The courtyard itself was a marvel of shaded tranquility, designed to shut out the clamor of the desert city. A stone colonnade supported a pergola heavy with trailing vines, casting dappled, restless shadows across a central pool of cool, clear water that reflected the pale blue of the evening sky. Tall potted palms stood like silent sentinels in the corners, and the air was rich with the scent of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and the distant, sweet tang of ripening figs from the orchard beyond. Yet, for all its opulence, the house had long been a monument to solitude. Every archway, every marble mosaic, and every imported cedar beam had been purchased with the currency of isolation. Zacchaeus remembered the exact day the last merchant had refused to break bread at his table, the exact year the elders of the city had averted their eyes when he passed through the marketplace, and the cold, metallic clink of the silver denarii that had steadily filled his bronze strongboxes as his human connections withered away. He had built a fortress of wealth to protect himself from a world that despised him, only to discover that he had merely constructed a gilded tomb. Now, those very gates were thrown wide to the wind. Disciples and curious townspeople spilled into the shaded spaces, their dusty feet treading upon the mosaic floors without hesitation. Simon Peter, his weathered face still marked by the astonishment of the road, paused by the central pool, trailing a calloused hand through the cool water. Andrew and John spoke in hushed tones near the western archway, their eyes wandering over the lavish details of a home that belonged to a man everyone in Judea deemed a sinner beyond redemption. Zacchaeus felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability, not the defensive, prickly pride of the chief tax collector, but the raw, trembling exposure of a man standing naked in the light. He looked down at his own hands, soft-skinned and adorned with gold rings, hands that had counted Roman coin, seized securities, and levied extortionate tolls on the weary caravans traveling the trade route from Damascus to Egypt. Those hands suddenly felt stained, clumsy, and entirely unworthy of the garments they wore or the presence that filled his courtyard. Jesus stopped near the center of the stone patio, turning to face his host with a gaze that bypassed all the defensive architecture of Zacchaeus' estate and looked straight into the quiet, beating heart within. "Zacchaeus," the teacher said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to soften the very stones of the courtyard. The tax collector stiffened slightly, a familiar reflex of self-preservation rising in his throat, before he bowed his head. "Master," he murmured, the title slipping from his lips not as a formality of submission, but as an acknowledgement of an undeniable truth. He was no longer the master of this house, he was merely a guest in his own home, rescued from the dark exile of his own making. "A house is built with stone and mortar," Jesus said gently, looking around at the vaulted ceilings and the rich tapestries that lined the walls, "but a home is sustained by the breath of living souls." "How long has it been since laughter echoed against these cedar beams, Zacchaeus? How long since the bread broken at this table was shared with those who had nothing to give in return?" The words were not an accusation, they were an invitation to look inward, to strip away the illusions of sufficiency and examine the hollow chambers of a life spent accumulating things that could never fill an aching void. Zacchaeus felt the sting of tears behind his eyelids, hot, sudden, and cleansing. He thought of the endless rows of ledgers in his private chamber upstairs, the ink-stained scrolls recording every debt, every forfeited field, every desperate family that had been forced to mortgage their future to pay Caesar's insatiable demands and line the pockets of Rome's chief collaborator in Jericho. "Too long," Zacchaeus whispered, his voice cracking slightly against the stillness of the courtyard. He swallowed hard, gathering his courage, knowing that the grace he had received was not a cheap pardon that ignored the past, but a transformative fire that required everything to be set right. "Master, look upon me. I have lived my life believing that security could be measured in weight, in silver, in the distance I kept between myself and the world." He stepped closer to the center of the patio, raising his voice so that not only Jesus, but the disciples and the townspeople gathered in the porticos could hear every word. The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted, the restless murmurs dying away into a deep, anticipatory hush. The fading sunlight caught the edges of the marble pillars, turning the dust motes suspended in the air into a shimmering veil of gold. "Behold," Zacchaeus declared, his stature seeming to grow as the moral weight of his decision took hold of him. "Half of my goods I give to the poor. Not a tithe, not a token offering from the surplus of my abundance, but half of everything I possess, my lands, my coin, my storehouses. Let it be distributed among the widows, the orphans, and those who have suffered beneath the cruelty of my office." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd gathered under the pergola. Half of an estate as vast as Zacchaeus's would amount to a fortune capable of transforming the economic landscape of Jericho overnight. It was an act of madness, whispered the skeptical voices in the shadows, a sudden, reckless gesture born of emotional exhaustion that the tax collector would surely regret come morning. Yet Zacchaeus did not waver. The tight, defensive knot in his stomach had completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, soaring lightness that felt like flight. The silver in his strong boxes suddenly lost its cold, alluring luster. It was no longer a shield against the world, but mere metal, useful only insofar as it could heal the wounds he had inflicted. Jesus smiled, a deep, radiant expression of approval that seemed to illuminate the deepening shadows of the courtyard. He did not interrupt, knowing that the transformation unfolding before him was sacred, a soul untangling itself from the heavy nets of greed. Zacchaeus turned his gaze toward the outer rim of the crowd, where several local merchants and townspeople stood with expressions of stunned disbelief. Among them, he caught sight of an older man with a weather-beaten face and threadbare garments, a farmer from the outskirts of the oasis whose olive grove had been seized 2 years prior under a disputed tax assessment. Zacchaeus remembered the man's tearful pleas, remembered the cold wave of indifference with which he had turned his back and signaled the Roman guard to clear the courtyard. "And if I have defrauded anyone of anything," Zacchaeus continued, his voice ringing clear and steady through the open-air pavilion, "I restore it fourfold." Fourfold. The penalty prescribed by ancient law for a confessed theft, a standard of restitution so demanding that virtually no one in Judea ever practiced it voluntarily. To return 4 times what had been taken meant that Zacchaeus would not merely empty his surplus, he would drain his accounts, surrender his luxury, and strip away every last vestige of the ill-gotten wealth that had made him a prince among extortioners. It meant that he would walk out of this courtyard a poor man, a man starting over with empty hands. And yet, as the words left his lips, Zacchaeus had never felt wealthier. The gold was gone, but in its place was something infinitely more enduring, a clear conscience, an unburdened spirit, and the quiet, radiant assurance that he was no longer an outcast. A murmur of profound astonishment rippled through the gathered throng. The old farmer near the archway stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and dawning hope, staring at the chief tax collector as if seeing a ghost. The hostility that had saturated the Jericho air for years, the bitter resentment, the muttered curses, the averted eyes, began to dissolve, melting away in the warmth of an unmerited, radical generosity that defied every rule of the world they lived in. Jesus stepped forward and placed a warm, firm hand upon Zacchaeus' shoulder. The touch grounded the tax collector, anchoring him in the reality of this miraculous moment. "Today," Jesus said, his voice carrying clearly across the entire courtyard, reaching every ear, every heart, and every lingering doubt, "Salvation has come to this house, because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." The word settled over the assembly like a gentle benediction. The lost. Zacchaeus repeated the phrase quietly in his mind. He had been lost indeed, wandering for years in the dense, thorny thicket of his own making, hiding in the branches of a sycamore tree to catch a fleeting glimpse of something holy, only to find that holiness had been standing beneath him all along, calling him by name, inviting itself into the messy, complicated interior of his life. The sun finally dipped below the horizon of the Judean hills, casting a brilliant wash of amber, violet, and deep indigo across the evening sky. The stars began to emerge one by one, steady and bright above the palm fronds and the flat roofs of Jericho. Inside the courtyard, the tension of the day gave way to an atmosphere of unexpected festivity. Servants, taking their cue from their master's transformed countenance, began rolling out heavy wooden tables beneath the pergola, setting them with fresh loaves of bread, roasted lamb, bowls of bitter herbs, and pitchers of cool, sweet water. There was no longer any division between the disciples, the townspeople, the skeptics, and the household staff. They mingled freely among the marble pillars, speaking in low, wonder-filled tones, sharing the space that had so recently been a fortress of exclusivity. Zacchaeus moved among them not as a dreaded overlord demanding tribute, but as a brother, a fellow pilgrim resting by the well after a long and difficult journey. He walked toward the central pool, pausing to look down at his reflection in the dark, still water. The face looking back at him was the same, the sharp features, the premature lines around his eyes, the fine linens of his station still draped over his shoulders, yet everything about him was changed. The restless ambition that had driven him to climb the sycamore tree earlier that afternoon had vanished, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. He reached up with a steady hand and unclasped one of his heavy gold rings, dropping it quietly into a bronze basin on a nearby ledge. He didn't need it anymore. Across the courtyard, Jesus was seated at the head of the long wooden table, breaking a loaf of bread and passing pieces to those nearest him with a quiet, joyful grace. He looked up, catching Zacchaeus' eye across the space, and nodded, a silent, knowing gesture that spoke of journeys completed, horizons crossed, and a new dawn that had finally broken over the dry, sun-baked streets of Jericho. Zacchaeus smiled back, feeling the last traces of his long loneliness drift away into the cool evening breeze. He walked toward the table, taking his place among the guests, ready to share in a meal that was not bought with coin, but offered in grace. The night deepened around them, soft and still, wrapping the oasis city in a blanket of quiet restoration while, inside the heart of the once-lost tax collector, the lights burned bright and warm, never to be extinguished again. The morning sun rose over the jagged limestone ridges of the Judean wilderness, spilling a cascade of liquid gold across the flat-roofed houses and swaying date palms of Jericho. Long before the heat of the day began to shimmer off the dusty thoroughfares, the oasis city was already teeming with a restless, churning energy. Pilgrims from Galilee, traders from Perea, and local townspeople choked the narrow avenues, their voices blending into a continuous, rising murmur that echoed against the ancient stone walls. They had come for the teacher of Nazareth. Word had traveled ahead of him like a swift desert wind, tales of healing water turned into wine, of sight restored to the blind in the beggar-lined ditches of Bethsaida, of a quiet, unyielding authority that left even the Roman centurion standing in thoughtful silence. Along the main stone-paved road that cut through the heart of the lower district, the crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, a living, breathing wall of anticipation. In the center of this swirling tide walked Jesus of Nazareth, flanked by his disciples. The dust kicked up by hundreds of sandals hung in the warm air, catching the early light in a golden haze. Jesus walked with an unhurried, steady grace, his stride measured, unaffected by the chaotic press of humanity that surged around him. His Galilean mantle, woven from rough, undyed wool, was gray with the dust of the Jericho road, and lines of deep, contemplative fatigue were etched around his eyes. Yet beneath that weariness burned a quiet, luminous focus, an immense, steady reservoir of compassion that seemed entirely untouched by the noise and the friction of the multitude. To his right, Peter wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand, casting a wary glance at the pressing throng. The fisherman-turned-disciple felt a familiar knot of protective anxiety tighten in his chest. Every step forward was a battle of inches, elbows brushing against strangers, frantic voices shouting questions, hands reaching out just to brush the hem of the master's garment. "Keep close, brothers," Peter murmured, his voice pitched low so as not to disturb the steady rhythm of their journey. "The crowd is too dense here." We will never reach the western gate before noon if they keep pressing in like this." Beside him, Andrew nodded, his gaze scanning the flat roofs and open balconies overlooking the street. They are like water behind a broken dam. Everyone wants a miracle. Everyone wants a sign. I only hope the teacher can find a moment to rest once we cross the plaza. Jesus heard them, though he did not alter his pace. He turned his head slightly, a faint, gentle smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The harvest is plentiful, Andrew," Jesus said softly, his voice carrying a rich, resonant warmth that seemed to cut cleanly through the surrounding din. "And people are hungry not for bread alone, but to know that they are seen. Look around you. No one is truly a crowd when you look into their eyes." Andrew fell silent, rebuked not by sharpness, but by the profound depth in his master's gaze. He watched as Jesus paused for a fraction of a second to look directly at a small, ragged child peering out from behind a clay water jar, offering the boy a nod so full of dignity and recognition that the child's fearful eyes instantly melted into wonder. The disciples exchanged glances, their protective instincts warring with a deep, humbling reverence. They were traveling with a man who possessed an infinite capacity for attention, moving through a world that measured worth by power and status, yet treating every soul he encountered as if they were the only person in creation. Meanwhile, a few streets over, the heavy bronze coin chests in the central toll station sat unmonitored. Zacchaeus had left them hours ago. For the first time in his professional life, the chief tax collector had abandoned his post while the morning traffic was at its peak. The thought would have caused him cold sweats only days before. Every lost denarius, every uncollected toll was a fissure in the fortress of numbers he had built around himself. But today, the ledgers remained open and unattended on the cedar desk, the heavy iron keys resting forgotten beside them. Zacchaeus hurried down a side alley, his short stature forcing him to take rapid, darting steps to keep pace with the distant roar of the multitude. His heart thrummed against his ribs with a nervous, breathless excitement. He was dressed not in his heavy, intimidating robes of office, but in a simpler, lighter tunic of undyed linen, though the fine quality of the weave still marked him as a man of means. He wanted no barriers between himself and the street today. He wanted only to see. As he reached the edge of the grand sycamore tree that dominated the open plaza near the public well, he found his way completely barred. The crowd was a solid, impenetrable wall of shoulders, turbans, and raised arms. Taller men stood 3 deep before him, craning their necks, shouting back and forth about whether the teacher had reached the square yet. Zacchaeus stood on his tiptoes, stretching his neck, but he could see nothing except the sun-baked backs of his fellow townspeople and the bright flash of Roman spears guarding the municipal gates in the distance. A familiar bitterness flickered at the edge of his thoughts, the old, stinging reminder of his physical smallness, a minor humiliation that had mirrored his spiritual isolation for so many years. The people around him shifted, and when someone accidentally stepped back onto his foot, no one turned to apologize. To them, he was merely empty space, a nuisance to be brushed aside, or worse, a traitor whose presence among them was an offense. "Move aside," Zacchaeus muttered, his voice thin and lost beneath the general roar. No one heard him. No one cared. Panic, sharp and cold, threatened to unravel his resolve. He had come this far, He had torn himself away from the safety of his ledgers, stripped off the armor of his office, and walked out into the open sunlight. He could not simply stand here and listen to the passing of footsteps, returning home with the bitter realization that he had missed the one moment that mattered. His eyes darted desperately up the massive, gnarled trunk of the sycamore tree. The tree stood at a slight tilt, its broad, sprawling branches extending low over the stone wall of a private courtyard, its dense canopy of broad, heart-shaped leaves providing a deep, cool pool of emerald shade against the blinding glare of the Judean sun. The bark was rough, deeply ridged like petrified waves, offering numerous footholds for someone small and agile enough to climb. Without pausing to calculate his dignity, without caring what the merchants at the market stalls or his own underlings might say if they saw the chief tax collector scrambling up a public tree like a mischievous boy, Zacchaeus grabbed a low-hanging branch. He hooked his fingers into the rough bark, set his sandal against a sturdy knot, and hauled himself upward. The effort was sudden, tearing slightly at the fabric of his sleeve and scraping his palm against the abrasive wood, but adrenaline carried him higher. He scrambled from branch to branch, the rough leaves brushing against his face, releasing a heavy, earthy fragrance of crushed green sap and ripening fruit. The noise of the street faded slightly, muffled by the thick foliage, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves stirring in the rising desert wind. Higher he climbed, until he found a secure perch where two massive limbs forked outward directly over the main thoroughfare. Peering through a natural window in the dense leaves, Zacchaeus found himself looking down upon the street from an entirely new perspective. The world below looked small, almost fragile. The continuous stream of people flowed like a river of colorful cloth and bobbing heads directly beneath his feet. He could see the dust rising in plumes, could smell the mingling scents of roasted chickpeas from a nearby vendor, unwashed wool, and sweet perfume. And right there, moving through the center of the human tide like a steady anchor in a storm, came Jesus. Zacchaeus froze, his breath catching in his throat. From this elevated vantage point, he could see the teacher clearly. Jesus was speaking quietly to James, who walked beside him, occasionally listening as a local elder pointed toward the towering facade of the Herodian palace in the distance. The sunlight caught the rich, dark waves of Jesus' hair and illuminated the gentle, compassionate lines of his face. There was an absolute absence of pretense in his bearing. He did not walk with the stiff, guarded arrogance of the temple priests, nor with the cold, calculating indifference of the Roman magistrates. He moved through the world as though he belonged to it entirely, yet was untouched by its corruption. The disciples around him were engaged in a quiet debate, their brows furrowed as they tried to manage the chaotic flow of the throng. "If we take the northern bypass," Philip was saying, gesturing toward a narrower lane that wound away from the bustling market, "we can avoid the main gate entirely and reach the oasis gardens before sunset, and disappoint half the city." Bartholomew countered, shaking his head. "Look at them, Philip. They have been waiting since dawn. If we turn down a side alley now, they will think we are fleeing." Jesus listened to their anxious plotting with a faint, knowing smile. He reached out to steady an elderly woman who had stumbled in the rush, his hand gently grasping her forearm until she regained her footing, and blessed him with a tearful, trembling smile. And then, as the procession drew directly beneath the sprawling canopy of the sycamore tree, Jesus stopped. The sudden halt of the central figure caused a ripple effect through the entire company. Peter bumped gently into Jesus' shoulder, and the disciples behind them crowded close, murmuring in surprise. The surrounding townspeople, sensing the abrupt cessation of movement, ground to a halt as well, the collective momentum of the crowd collapsing inward like a settling wave. A sudden, breathless hush fell over the immediate vicinity. Jesus did not look left, where the market stalls beckoned. He did not look right, toward the grand stone facade of the governor's residence. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement, he tilted his head upward. His eyes, clear and deep as an ancient desert well, rose through the emerald leaves of the sycamore tree. They locked instantly upon Zacchaeus. There was no confusion in that gaze, no fleeting glance of casual curiosity. It was a look of absolute, penetrating recognition, the look of someone who had known the Watcher before the foundation of the world, who had seen every hidden ledger, every lonely evening, every cold coin dropped into the bronze box, and every silent, aching regret buried deep beneath the hardened shell of pride. Zacchaeus felt as though a lightning bolt had passed silently through his entire being. Every sound in the bustling city, the shouting vendors, the crying children, the tramping of sandals, the distant barking of dogs, vanished into absolute nothingness. There was only the rustle of the leaves, the warmth of the sun on his face, and the quiet, radiant gaze of the teacher looking up at him from the dust of the road. A profound, shattering warmth bloomed in the center of Zacchaeus' chest, melting away years of accumulated frost in a single, timeless heartbeat. Then Jesus smiled, a wide, bright, beautiful smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and radiated an unmerited, staggering grace. "Zacchaeus," Jesus called out, his voice rich and clear, carrying effortlessly up into the branches of the tree, ringing with an intimacy that felt as though they were standing alone in a quiet garden. "Hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." The words hung in the warm desert air, vibrating against the leaves and echoing softly across the stunned silence of the plaza. For a long, suspended moment, the world stood entirely still. Zacchaeus could not move. His fingers remained locked around the rough branch, his mind racing to process the impossible weight of what he had just heard. "Must stay at your house." Not the house of the respected elders, not the clean, pious home of the synagogue ruler, not the dwelling of a righteous man whose hands were free of compromise, but his house. The house tainted by collaboration with the oppressor. The house built on the extraction of wealth from the poor. The house that had echoed for years with the hollow, solitary clinking of unshed silver. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd, starting as a low, uneasy buzzing and quickly swelling into an indignant wave of restless discontent. "Did you hear him?" a merchant near the front whispered loudly, his face contorting with shock and disbelief, his finger pointing accusingly toward the tree. "He is speaking to Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. He is going to stay at a sinner's house," another voice spat, dripping with bitter disgust. "A traitor who lines his pockets with Roman gold while our families starve under the yoke. How can a holy rabbi, a prophet of God, cross that threshold?" The discontent spread like wildfire through the packed ranks of the people. Heads turned, fingers pointed, and a chorus of disapproving mutters rose into the clear morning sky. The disciples exchanged uneasy, troubled glances, their earlier protective anxiety returning tenfold. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from the angry faces of the townspeople back to Jesus, a deep furrow appearing on his brow. "Master," Peter murmured, stepping in close and lowering his voice, a note of urgent caution in his tone. "Surely you know who leave behind those walls. The entire city knows. He is an outcast by choice and by law. If you enter his home, the religious leaders in Jerusalem will hear of it before the week is out. They will use this to turn the people against you entirely." Jesus did not turn away from the tree. He kept his eyes fixed gently on Zacchaeus, ignoring the rising tide of public indignation as easily as a mountain ignores the wind that beats against its slopes. "A physician does not go to the healthy, Peter," Jesus replied softly, his voice steady and luminous, carrying a quiet authority that gently silenced the disciples' objections. "He goes to the sick. And there are many kinds of sickness in this city, some that show on the skin, and some that eat quietly away at the soul." High up in the branches, the sheer magnitude of what was happening crashed over Zacchaeus. Tears, hot and unbidden, sprang to his eyes, cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. For his entire adult life, he had been defined by labels whispered behind his back: extortioner, traitor, sinner, outsider. He had accepted those labels, armored himself against them, and used wealth as a shield to prove that he did not need the love or approval of the community that despised him. But Jesus did not look at his labels. Jesus looked at him. With trembling hands and a heart beating with a fierce, joyful urgency, Zacchaeus did not hesitate. He scrambled backward out of the fork of the branches, grabbed the trunk, and slid down with reckless haste, ignoring the fresh scrapes on his palms and the tearing of his linen tunic. He dropped from the lowest branch directly onto the dusty road, landing right before Jesus. Without a moment of hesitation, the chief tax collector fell to his knees in the dust at the teacher's feet. The gesture was not one of cringing subservience, but of profound, total surrender, the posture of a man who had dropped every weapon he had ever carried. Jesus stepped forward and, with a gentle, calloused hand, reached down to take Zacchaeus by the elbow, lifting him effortlessly to his feet. As their eyes met at close range, the last remaining walls around Zacchaeus' heart crumbled completely into dust. "Look at me, Lord," Zacchaeus said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear through the stunned quiet. "Here, now. Half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." The declaration was staggering. Fourfold restitution was the penalty demanded by Mosaic law only for the most egregious forms of calculated theft. It was a sweeping, absolute emptying of his accumulated wealth, a total undoing of every unjust transaction he had ever executed. A stunned silence fell over the murmuring crowd. The merchants and townspeople who had been denouncing him moments before now stared in absolute disbelief. The ledgers of Jericho were being rewritten right here in the dust of the street, not by the force of Roman decree or the threats of the Sanhedrin, but by the overwhelming, spontaneous flood of a transformed heart. Jesus smiled, a radiant expression of pure, unadulterated joy that seemed to illuminate the entire square. he placed his hand gently on Zacchaeus' shoulder, a gesture of profound acceptance and public honor that bridged the chasm between the outcast and the community in a single touch. "Today," Jesus said, his voice ringing clear and strong across the silent plaza, "salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." The tension in the air dissolved, replaced by a deep, reverent stillness. The sun continued its slow, majestic climb into the azure sky, casting a warm, golden light over the dusty streets of Jericho, the swaying palms of the oasis, and the broad, protective canopy of the sycamore tree. Turning side by side, Jesus and the newly redeemed tax collector began to walk together toward the quiet, opulent courtyard house down the lane, followed by a transformed company of disciples and a hushed, spellbound crowd, stepping forward into a new day of grace, restoration, and enduring peace. The dust of Jericho settled slowly around the broad, green expanse of the sycamore tree, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred in the heavy, sun-baked air. Above, the ancient leaves rustled softly in a stray desert breeze, catching the amber light of the late afternoon and scattering shimmering patterns of gold across the white limestone path. Zacchaeus walked beside the Galilean teacher, his footsteps unhurried for the first time in as many years as he could remember. The fine, imported linen of his tunic, usually stiff with pride and pulled tight against the world, felt suddenly light against his skin, as though a heavy coat of armor had been quietly unbuckled and laid down in the dirt. He could still feel the lingering warmth of the glance Jesus had cast upward through the dusty foliage, a look that had pierced straight through the layers of coins, ledgers, ironclad gates, and bitter isolation, finding the lonely boy who had hidden behind ledgers for half a lifetime. Behind them, the crowd parted like water before a moving keel, no longer murmuring with bitter resentment or sharp-tongued envy. A profound, hushed reverence had settled over the street. Merchants leaned against their wooden stalls, forgetting to hawk their wares. Roman guards resting near the municipal archways lowered their spears a fraction of an inch, caught in the quiet gravity of the procession. The disciples walked a few paces behind, their faces softened from earlier confusion into a quiet, luminous awe, realizing once again that the margins of the world were precisely where their master's heart dwelt. The lane narrowed as it wound away from the bustling market square, leading toward the more affluent quarter where the villas of Jericho's elite stood behind high, whitewashed walls. Yet Zacchaeus did not lead them to the grand public entrance of his estate, where armed guards usually stood to bar the rabble. Instead, with a gentle gesture of his hand, he guided Jesus toward a low, arched wooden side gate that opened directly into his private inner courtyard. As the heavy timber creaked open, a wave of cool air spilled out from the shaded interior, carrying the delicate, refreshing scent of blooming jasmine and the faint, musical tinkle of a stone fountain. This courtyard was the sanctuary Zacchaeus had built to protect himself from a world that despised him. Every stone had been laid with precision, every tile imported at great expense, yet until this moment, the space had been nothing more than a magnificent tomb for a leaveman. The silence here had been heavy with unspent wealth and the hollow echo of footsteps that had no one to greet. Jesus stepped across the threshold, his sandals whispering against the mosaic tiles. He did not look at the intricate stonework, nor did he marvel at the rare pomegranate trees that shaded the eastern wall. Instead, his eye swept over the quiet beauty of the space with a warm, approving serenity, as if he were recognizing a home he had long prepared for. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtyard, where a stone basin caught the clear, bubbling water of a spring, and turned to face his host. Zacchaeus stood in the doorway, his small frame suddenly trembling with a profound, rushing wave of realization. The proximity of this man, this teacher whose very presence exposed every hidden creaking floorboard of the tax collector's soul, demanded a response that went far beyond mere hospitality. All the silver denarii he had hoarded in the dark bronze chests beneath his floorboards, all the extortionate tallies he had exacted from desperate travelers at the city gate, suddenly appeared in their true, pitiful light, heavy, cold stones that had kept him from the only warmth that truly mattered. With a sudden, decisive motion that surprised even himself, Zacchaeus stepped forward, knelt on the cool stones before the Galilean, and raised his voice, clear and resonant in the quiet courtyard. "Look, Lord," Zacchaeus spoke, his voice steady though his hands shook slightly against his knees. "Here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." The declaration hung in the fragrant air, absolute and irrevocable. It was not a reluctant bargain struck with a guilty conscience, but a joyful unburdening, a wholesale sweeping away of the past. 4-fold restitution was the strict penalty demanded by ancient law for the worst kind of theft, but here it was offered willingly, eagerly, as a man might throw off a burning garment to plunge into cool, healing water. Jesus looked down at him, and the lines of travel weariness around his eyes crinkled with a deep, radiant smile. There was no interrogation here, no demand for further penance, only the quiet validation of a soul restored to its true alignment. "Today salvation has come to this house," Jesus said, his voice carrying a rich, resonant warmth that seemed to fill every corner of the courtyard, echoing softly against the whitewashed walls. "Because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." The disciples gathered quietly around the edges of the courtyard, their hearts swelling with a deep, wordless understanding. Peter leaned against a stone pillar, folding his arms across his broad chest as he watched the tax collector rise to his feet. The fisherman from Galilee remembered his own calling by the lake shore. The nets dropped in an instant, the sudden, terrifying summons into a larger life, and he saw the very same miracle unfolding here among the desert palms of Jericho. There was no person too tangled in the webs of this world, no heart too heavily armored by greed or social ruin, to be reached by the patient, relentless pursuit of grace. The afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long, elegant shadows across the tiled floor of the courtyard. The harsh, blinding glare of the midday desert softened into a rich tapestry of amber, violet, and deep indigo. The intense heat of the day yielded gracefully to a gentle, cooling breeze that rustled the leaves of the pomegranate trees and danced across the surface of the fountain. Zacchaeus turned to his household servants, who had gathered near the inner archway, their faces a mixture of astonishment and tentative joy. The rigid hierarchy of fear and intimidation that had governed this house for years dissolved in a single afternoon. With a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in memory, Zacchaeus began to issue instructions not with the sharp bark of a master demanding obedience, but with the warm, collaborative energy of a host preparing a feast for cherished friends. Tables were brought out into the open air, long wooden boards polished by years of silent use, now quickly covered with linen cloths and laden with fresh bread, roasted figs, cool well water, and sweet wine. There was no hesitation, no holding back of the finest stores for fear of scarcity. The abundance that had once been locked away in dark storehouses was now poured out freely, shared among traveling preachers, humble fishermen, curious servants, and a transformed master of the house who finally understood the true currency of life. As the twilight deepened and the first bright stars began to prick through the velvety purple dome of the Judean sky, lanterns were lit along the courtyard walls. Their warm, flickering glow cast dancing shadows over the faces of the gathered company, who sat together around the long tables in a profound, harmonious communion. Jesus sat at the head of the company, breaking bread with hands that had touched the sick, calmed the winds, and now welcomed the outcast back into the human family. He spoke softly, sharing parables of lost coins found in dusty corners, of wandering sheep carried home on weary shoulders, and of a Father whose patience outlasts the longest winter of the soul. The disciples listened, their minds expanding to grasp the boundless architecture of a mercy that knew no social borders, no ethnic divisions, and no final disqualifications. Zacchaeus listened from across the table, his heart light and quiet, attuned to the gentle cadence of the teacher's voice. He looked around the circle at the faces illuminated by the lamplight, faces that hours before would have turned away from him in disgust or hatred. Now, they looked back at him with the easy, unreserved affection of brothers. The isolation that had been his constant companion for decades had vanished, melted away by the simple, radical act of being truly seen and truly loved. Outside the high courtyard walls, the city of Jericho murmured softly under the starlight, its dusty streets settling into a peaceful, cooling night. But inside this walled sanctuary, time seemed to slow down, holding the moment in a timeless suspension of grace. The metallic clink of bronze collection boxes and the harsh reckonings of the toll booth belonged to another world entirely, a faded, distant dream of a life left behind on the sun-baked road. Here, under the whispering canopy of the pomegranate trees and the watchful, loving eye of the Galilean rabbi, a new story had begun. It was a story written not in ledgers of debt and credit, but in the quiet, enduring ink of forgiveness, restoration, and peace. And as the night deepened around them, holding the oasis in its cool, comforting embrace, the heart of Jericho beat in a slower, gentler rhythm, attuned at last to the quiet music of grace. The heavy wooden doors of the courtyard remained closed to the dusty clamor of the street, yet the echoes of the afternoon still lingered in the cool, shaded air of the inner colonnade. Outside, the great throngs of pilgrims and townspeople had begun to disperse, their loud murmurs dissolving into the soft, evening calls of desert birds wheeling above the mud-brick rooftops of Jericho. Zacchaeus sat upon a low stone bench near the central fountain, the steady, rhythmic splash of water offering a gentle counterpoint to the quiet racing of his thoughts. The fine linen of his tunic, which earlier that day had felt like a fortress of status and untouchable authority, now felt merely soft, shedding the oppressive weight of a persona he had worn for decades. In his lap rested a heavy leather ledger, its corners worn smooth by years of anxious counting, its pages filled with columns of figures, names, coins, and calculated debts. Across the open courtyard, seated upon a woven mat beneath the sprawling branches of a pomegranate tree, Jesus of Nazareth spoke softly with the members of the household. The evening breeze carried fragments of quiet laughter and the low, resonant timbre of the teacher's voice, a sound devoid of the harsh demands or sharp barbs that Zacchaeus was so accustomed to receiving from his fellow citizens. Abigail, the elderly widow whose family vineyard had long suffered under the rigorous demands of the district tolls, moved quietly among the stone pillars carrying a clay pitcher of cool water. Her steps were measured, her face lined with the deep topography of a hard life. Leave 13, under the relentless Judean sun. Earlier, standing in the dense crowd by the sycamore tree, her heart had burned with a bitter resentment at the sight of the chief tax collector being singled out for honor by the beloved rabbi. She had remembered her late husband's despair, the seizure of their ancestral press, and the cold, unyielding ink strokes of Zacchaeus's quill. Yet as she approached the low table to refill the earthen goblets, her gaze flicked toward the small man sitting by the fountain. There was no arrogance in his posture now, no sharp squint of calculation in his eyes. He sat with his shoulders slightly bowed, staring down at the leather ledger in his lap with an expression of profound, aching weariness. Jesus paused his conversation, turning his head slightly to meet Abigail's gaze as she set the pitcher down. There was no accusation in the rabbi's eyes, only a quiet, luminous invitation that seemed to dissolve the decades of grievance hardening in the old woman's chest. "The evening air brings a welcome relief to the stones," Abigail murmured, her voice raspy from years of dust and weeping. It was the first time she had spoken civilly within these walls in memory. Zacchaeus looked up, startled, his dark eyes meeting hers across the dimming courtyard. For a fraction of a second, instinct urged him to withdraw, to pull back behind the impenetrable armor of his office, to remind her of the legalities and the Roman authority backing every coin he had ever collected. But the presence of Jesus, hovering like a warm, steady light at the edge of the garden, stripped away the utility of defense. "The heat lingered longer than usual today," Zacchaeus replied, his voice uncharacteristically soft, lacking the clipped authority he usually wielded in the public square. He reached down and laid his hand flat against the worn leather of the ledger, feeling the bulk of it beneath his palm. Perhaps the seasons are shifting." Abigail lingered by the fountain, her hand resting on the rim of the clay pitcher. She looked at the small man who had held the economic life of the oasis in his thin fingers. The irony of the afternoon, that the holiest man in Israel had chosen to dine at the table of the greatest sinner in Jericho, still hummed in the air like the fading resonance of a bronze bell. But the anger that had fueled her steps through the murmuring crowd earlier that day had mysteriously evaporated, replaced by a strange, hollow quietude. "My husband always said the soil here remembered everything," Abigail said softly, her eyes drifting toward the shadows gathering beneath the colonnade. "He said every drop of sweat mixed into the furrow stayed in the earth, demanding a reckoning." Zacchaeus swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat having nothing to do with the desert wind. He was right, Zacchaeus confessed, the words slipping out of him before he could stop them, carrying the weight of a confession long overdue. "The earth remembers. And the ledgers remember every fraction of a denarius." He lifted the heavy book slightly, as if offering it up to the evening sky, or perhaps to the quiet observer seated beneath the pomegranate tree. "Every coin extracted beyond what was due," Zacchaeus continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "every family pushed to the brink of desperation so that my own coffers might overflow with Roman silver. I told myself it was merely business. I told myself that someone had to do the work, that power requires a hard heart. He shook his head, a slow, self-accusing motion. I built a wall around myself, Abigail, higher than the city ramparts. And I sat inside it alone. Abigail listened, watching the chief tax collector dismantle his own fortress with bare hands. The bitterness that had anchored her soul for so long suddenly felt heavy and useless, like carrying a sack of stones up a steep hill long after the journey had ended. She looked from Zacchaeus to Jesus, who sat quietly, observing the exchange with a deep, patient attentiveness that made both of them feel as though they were the only two souls in the entire world. "A wall keeps others out, Master Tax Collector," Abigail said quietly, using his title without the usual venom, turning it instead into a simple statement of fact. "But it keeps you in the dark." Before Zacchaeus could answer, Jesus rose from his mat and walked slowly across the mosaic floor toward them. His sandals made a soft scuffing sound against the cool stones. The linen of his robe caught the pale amber light of a rising oil lamp, casting long, gentle shadows across the courtyard. "The dark is only a place where the morning has not yet reached," Jesus said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to thaw the very stones of the pavement. He placed a hand gently on Zacchaeus' shoulder, a touch entirely free of judgment or demand. Zacchaeus looked up into the rabbi's face, seeing the fine lines of fatigue etched around his eyes from the long walk from Jericho's gates toward the unforgiving ascent of the Judean wilderness, yet those eyes shone with an undiminished, luminous clarity. In that gaze, Zacchaeus did not see a reflection of his failures, nor a catalogue of his greed. He saw an expansive, unmerited horizon where a new life could actually begin. "Lord," Zacchaeus whispered, the word rising from a deep, long-dormant place inside his chest, "half of all my possessions I now give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, if I have taken a single coin through false accusation, I restore it fourfold." The declaration hung in the quiet air of the courtyard, absolute and unhesitating. It was not a tentative bargain struck with a deity for the sake of appeasement, it was the total dismantling of his identity. Fourfold restitution meant that the vast fortune accumulated over years of ruthless efficiency would vanish by morning. It meant that his grand estate, his imported silks, his security, and his standing among the Roman elite would be traded away for empty hands and a clear conscience. Abigail caught her breath, her hand tightening on the clay pitcher. Fourfold. By the strict laws of the Torah, restitution required the principal plus a fraction, but fourfold was the measure demanded of a thief caught red-handed with the livestock of his neighbor. For the chief tax collector to voluntarily apply the penalty of a common thief to his entire career was an act so radical, so staggering in its generosity, that it stunned the silence of the night. Jesus smiled, a radiant, transformative expression that seemed to illuminate the entire courtyard, driving the lingering shadows back toward the outer walls. "Today salvation has come to this house," Jesus said, his voice carrying clearly across the open space, reaching the ears of every servant, every guest, and every lingering member of the household who had watched the drama unfold from the shadows. "Because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." The word settled over the gathering like a benediction. Zacchaeus closed the heavy leather ledger, the sound of the cover snapping shut echoing softly in the quiet night. He did not open it again. The columns of figures, the calculated percentages, the bitter tally of human debt, all of it was finished. He stood up from the stone bench, feeling strangely light, as if the physical weight of the silver he had hoarded had somehow been lifted from his frame. Abigail stepped forward, her initial hostility entirely dissolved by the vastness of the moment. She looked at the man who had once been her family's greatest tormentor, and then she looked at the empty space between them where the ledger had rested. "My vineyard," Abigail said, her voice trembling slightly with a newly found vulnerability, was valued at 20 denarii when the Levi was doubled 3 winters ago. Zacchaeus nodded, his eyes steady and clear. "It shall be returned to you by sunrise, Abigail, with 4 times its yield accounted for from my personal reserves. Not as a settlement, but as an inheritance restored." Tears welled in the old woman's eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks to catch the amber light of the oil lamps. For years, she had nursed her grief like a precious ember, keeping it alive through sheer force of will because justice seemed an impossible dream in a world ruled by occupying legions and greedy middlemen. Now, standing beneath the starry Judean sky, justice had arrived not through the edge of a sword or the decree of a magistrate, but through the broken, healing heart of a transformed man. She reached out her weathered hand, and after a momentary hesitation, Zacchaeus took it in his own. Their grip was firm, sealing a covenant far older and more enduring than any Roman contract written on parchment or stamped in bronze. Around them, the household began to stir with a quiet, purposeful energy. Servants who had spent the afternoon trembling at the tension between their master and the surging crowds outside now moved with smiles on their faces, clearing the low tables, trimming the wicks of the clay lamps, and preparing bedding for the unexpected guests who had brought such an astonishing peace into their midst. The street outside the great wooden doors had finally grown completely silent. The murmuring crowd that had lined the dusty road earlier that afternoon, shouting judgments and pressing in with their collective fury and curiosity, had long since retreated to their tents and rented rooms across the sprawling oasis. The city of Jericho slept under a vast canopy of desert stars, completely unaware of the quiet earthquake that had just reshaped the spiritual landscape of its most notorious citizen. Jesus walked toward the low parapet at the edge of the flat stone roof, looking out over the sleeping expanse of palm groves and silver-leafed olive trees that stretched toward the dark, imposing silhouette of the wilderness mountains. The road to Jerusalem waited just beyond the eastern gate, a steep, winding ascent through bandit-ridden canyons that would ultimately lead to trial, suffering, and a destiny far greater than any earthly kingdom. But for tonight, the journey had paused in an oasis of grace. Zacchaeus climbed the external stone staircase to the roof, joining the Galilean teacher at the parapet. The cool night air ruffled his hair, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of ripening sycamore fruit from the trees lining the distant avenue below, the very trees that had offered him an unexpected vantage point earlier that afternoon. "The crowd is gone," Zacchaeus observed quietly, leaning his forearms against the cool stone of the wall. "They are resting," Jesus replied, without turning his head, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the first faint glimmer of dawn was beginning to paint the edges of the Moabite hills with a bruised, beautiful purple. "Just as you are learning to rest." Zacchaeus looked down at his empty hands, turning them over palms up, feeling the cool desert wind brush across skin that no longer clutched at gold or guarded ledgers. The isolation that had defined his existence for as long as he could remember was gone, replaced by an expansive sense of belonging to a community he had spent his entire life alienating. "I was so afraid of being small," Zacchaeus whispered, the confession a final shedding of the armor he no longer needed. "I thought if I wasn't powerful, if I didn't hold the silver, the world would simply crush me and leave me in the dirt." Jesus turned to look at him then, his eyes shining with an infinite, tender understanding. "You were looking for greatness in the ledgers, Zacchaeus. But true greatness is found only in the courage to be small enough to receive love." The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness, but a vast, breathing quiet that seemed to encompass the entire oasis of Jericho. Below them, the fountain continued its steady, musical splash, washing away the dust of the day. In the courtyard, Abigail and the members of the household moved in harmonious rhythm, their tasks completed, their spirits quieted by the extraordinary grace that had filled their home. The air grew cooler, the stars above burning with a diamond-like brilliance against the velvet expanse of the night sky. The tension of the public square, the harsh clink of the bronze collection boxes, the burning glare of the Judean sun, all of it had receded into a distant memory, swallowed by the profound, healing stillness of the evening. Zacchaeus took a deep, steady breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs entirely, unhindered by anxiety or regret. He stood tall on the stone roof, no longer measuring his worth by his stature or his wealth, but by the quiet, enduring grace that had sought him out in the branches of the sycamore tree and called him home by name. And as the night deepened around them, holding the ancient city in its gentle, restorative embrace, the heart of Jericho beat in a slower, peaceful rhythm, resting at last beneath the steady, watchful light of dawn's approach. The heavy oak doors of the courtyard, which for so many years had remained bolted against the murmurs and jeers of the street, now stood wide open to the cool morning air. Outside, the dusty alleys of Jericho were beginning to wake, the early morning light painting the mud brick walls in shades of soft amber and rose. But inside Zacchaeus' home, the atmosphere was entirely changed. The oppressive silence that had once haunted the mosaic-tiled floors had been replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of genuine peace. Zacchaeus stood by the central courtyard fountain, the cool water splashing gently over his hands. He was no longer wearing the heavy, ostentatious purple-bordered tunic that had once served as his armor against the world. Instead, he wore a simple, unadorned garment of undyed linen, comfortable and light against his skin. His reflection in the rippling water showed a man whose shoulders were no longer burdened by an invisible weight. The sharp, defensive squint that had defined his gaze for decades had softened into a steady, clear-eyed serenity. Across the courtyard, Tamar was busy arranging clay pitchers filled with fresh water and baskets of warm, barley bread baked just before dawn. Her movements, once cautious and hurried as if she feared drawing attention to herself, were now fluid and unhurried. A small, contented smile touched the corners of her mouth as she worked. For the first time, she belonged to a household that felt less like a gilded fortress and more like a true home. The whispers of the servants from the lower quarters were no longer filled with apprehension about unpaid debts or the wrath of their master. Instead, they hummed with quiet wonder at the events of the previous evening. Only hours before, the grand dining hall had echoed with the sound of laughter, shared stories, and the clinking of simple clay cups. Jesus of Nazareth had reclined at the long cedar table, surrounded not by the wealthy elites or the religious scholars of Jerusalem, but by Zacchaeus, Tamar, and several of the household staff who had stepped out of the shadows to share the meal. There had been no judgment in the teacher's eyes, only a profound, attentive warmth that made every person at the table feel as though they were the only soul in the room. Zacchaeus could still feel the lingering resonance of the words he had spoken in the presence of his guest. He had stood before them all, his heart pounding not with fear, but with an overwhelming surge of liberation, and made his vow. Half of all his accumulated possessions, the gold, the silver, the rich tapestries, and the deeds to lands acquired through extortion, would be given directly to the poor of Jericho. And for anyone he had ever cheated, anyone from whom he had extracted a single extra coin through the abuse of his office, he would repay it 4 times over. It was a staggering sum. By the time the restitutions were complete, the vast fortune that had isolated him from his neighbors would be largely gone. But as Zacchaeus looked around the sunlit courtyard, he realized that he had never truly been rich until this moment. Wealth had been a substitute for belonging, a cold accumulation of metal to fill the hollow spaces inside his chest. Now, those spaces were filled with something infinitely more enduring. A soft knock echoed from the open street doors, pulling him from his thoughts. It was not the angry pounding of a creditor or the demanding rap of a Roman soldier, but a hesitant, gentle sound. Zacchaeus wiped his hands on a linen cloth and walked toward the entrance, his steps light and steady. Standing in the sunlight just beyond the threshold was an elderly man from the lower market district, a weaver named Eli. Eli's hands were calloused and stained with indigo dye, and his expression was a mixture of deep skepticism and hesitant hope. He clutched a worn woolen shawl tightly around his shoulders, looking as though he expected the doors to slam shut in his face at any second. "Zacchaeus," the old man said, his voice cracking slightly with age and lingering bitterness. "They are saying in the market, they are saying you sent word about the tax receipts from the winter wool trade. Is it true, or is this another clever trap?" Zacchaeus did not bristle, nor did he retreat behind a mask of administrative authority. He simply looked at the weaver with a gentle, steady gaze, seeing the lines of hardship etched deeply into the man's face, hardship that he himself had, in part, caused. "It is no trap, Eli," Zacchaeus replied, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the quiet entranceway. "Come inside out of the dust. Let us sit by the fountain." Eli blinked, clearly disoriented by the warmth in the tax collector's tone. He stepped across the threshold, his sandals clicking softly against the mosaic tiles. Zacchaeus led him to a stone bench beneath the shade of a flourishing pomegranate tree, signaling to Tamar, who promptly brought a small cup of cool water and a fresh loaf of bread. "I went through the ledgers last night," Zacchaeus continued, sitting beside the weaver. "During the winter census 3 years ago, I levied a double surcharge on your guild's wool transport. It was unjust. According to the tally, I took 40 silver denarii from you that were never owed to Rome." Eli tensed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his wooden staff. 40 denarii, the old man repeated bitterly. "That was my savings for a whole year. My daughter went without medicine because of that debt." "I know," Zacchaeus said softly, bowing his head in quiet acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. "And I cannot undo those years, Eli. But I can make it right. Today, my scribes are preparing the drafts. You will receive back not 40 denarii, but 160 for times what was taken from you. And your name is cleared in the municipal registers. You owe nothing more to the tax house. Ever." The weaver stared at him, his mouth slightly open, searching the eyes of the man before him for any trace of mockery or deception. He found none. There was only a profound, sorrowful humility and a radiant sincerity that seemed to strip away decades of accumulated resentment. Slowly, the tension left Eli's shoulders. His eyes welled with moisture, and he lowered his head, pressing a trembling hand against his face as a quiet sob escaped his lips. Zacchaeus reached out and placed a reassuring hand on the old weaver's shoulder. He did not speak, he simply let the silence hold them both, a bridge of shared humanity built across an abyss that had once seemed impassable. By mid-morning, the news had spread through the sun-drenched streets of Jericho like a gentle wind through the palm fronds. At first, the citizens of the oasis city could scarcely believe the reports. Tax collectors did not give back money, they swallowed it whole. Yet as the morning progressed, messengers from Zacchaeus' estate appeared in the bustling marketplace, summoning merchants, artisans, and laborers to verify accounts and receive vouchers for full restitution. The atmosphere in the central square shifted from cautious disbelief to a quiet, celebratory wonder. People gathered in small clusters near the stone wells, speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the strange and beautiful transformation that had taken place behind the high walls of the chief tax collector's home. The anger that had simmered in the hearts of the townspeople for years began to melt away, replaced by a collective sense of healing. Inside the courtyard, the steady stream of visitors continued, yet there was no chaos, only an orderly, peaceful procession of reconciliation. Zacchaeus listened to story after story of hardship and injustice, his heart expanding with every confession, every tear, and every smile of gratitude. He felt no desire to defend himself or minimize his past actions. He embraced the truth of his history, knowing that his identity was no longer anchored in what he had taken, but in the unmerited grace that had found him in the branches of the sycamore tree. As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp, brilliant shadows across the white stone walls, the heavy footsteps of Jesus and his disciples were heard once more at the outer gates. They had spent the morning walking among the palm groves and speaking with the people along the Jordan Road, but now they returned to the oasis home that had become the epicenter of a quiet spiritual awakening. Zacchaeus rose quickly from his seat by the fountain and hurried to the entrance, his face lit with a deep, irrepressible joy. Jesus stepped through the doorway, his sandals dusty from the road, his eyes bright with an unshakable peace. The Galilean teacher looked at Zacchaeus, noting the lighter step, the open posture, and the profound stillness that now radiated from the former outcast. "The work of restoration is well underway, I see," Jesus said, a warm smile touching his lips as he surveyed the courtyard where several citizens sat quietly conversing with the household staff. "It is, Rabbi," Zacchaeus replied, his voice steady and full of reverence. "For the first time in my life, I feel as though my house is truly open. not just to guests, but to the truth. Jesus placed a gentle hand on Zacchaeus' arm, a touch that conveyed both acknowledgement and blessing. "Today," Jesus said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a divine promise that echoed through the quiet corridors of the heart, "Salvation has come to this house. For even this man is a son of Abraham. The Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost, and what was lost has been found." The word settled over the courtyard like a benediction. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the pomegranate tree, carrying the sweet scent of ripening fruit and damp earth through the air. The disciples gathered around, sharing in the quiet triumph of the moment, their own weary spirits refreshed by the beauty of what they had witnessed in this desert city. They did not stay much longer in Jericho. The road to Jerusalem still stretched before them, climbing steadily upward through the rugged, sun-baked hills of Judea toward the great city where destiny awaited. But the departure was entirely different from the hurried, tense arrival of the previous day. There was no desperate crowd screaming for attention, no frantic scrambling up tree branches, and no heavy curtain of social ostracization. Instead, as Jesus and his followers stepped out onto the open road, a small company of townsfolk, including Eli the weaver and several others whose lives had been touched by the day's events, walked with them for the first 1 mile beyond the city gates. They walked not as a mob, but as companions on a shared journey, their steps keeping time with a gentle, unhurried rhythm. Zacchaeus stood at the edge of the oasis city, watching them ascend the first gentle slope of the Judean wilderness. The blazing sun beat down upon the rocky landscape, but the heat no longer felt oppressive or scorching. It felt warm, life-giving, and clear. He stood tall, his feet planted firmly on the earth, feeling entirely at home in his own skin. He did not need the validation of wealth, the protection of Roman power, or the approval of a stratified society to know his worth. He was known, he was forgiven, and he was free. Beside him, Tamar rested her hand on the stone marker of the city boundary, a quiet smile gracing her features as she looked out over the vast expanse of the desert hills stretching toward the horizon. The road ahead would bring changes, and the estate would look very different once the restitutions were fully paid and the wealth redistributed to those in need. But neither of them felt a flicker of fear. The scarcity that had once dictated their lives had been permanently replaced by an abundance of grace. Slowly, the group of travelers crested the rise of the hill, their figures silhouetted for a brief moment against the brilliant blue of the Judean sky before disappearing into the folds of the winding mountain path. Zacchaeus turned and began the short walk back toward his home. The streets of Jericho were quiet now, resting in the stillness of the afternoon heat. The air was sweet with the scent of crushed sycamore figs and blooming jasmine from the courtyard gardens. Every stone wall, every sun-drenched alley, and every corner of the bustling marketplace seemed washed in a new, clearer light. He crossed the threshold of his wide-open doors, stepping into the cool, shadowed sanctuary of the inner courtyard. The fountain continued its steady, hypnotic song, splashing water over the smooth stones in a timeless cadence. There were ledgers to review, accounts to settle, and neighbors to welcome, but there was no rush, no frantic striving, and no shadowed corners left to hide within his soul. Zacchaeus sat down on the stone bench beneath the pomegranate tree, closing his eyes for a quiet moment to simply listen to the gentle breathing of the house around him. The weight of the past had vanished, swept away by an act of unmerited mercy that had reached up into the branches of a roadside tree and called him home. The day wound slowly toward its evening rest, drawing a soft, golden curtain over the oasis city. The shadows lengthened across the mosaic floors, stretching out like long, welcoming arms. In the heart of Jericho, beneath the vast and steady expanse of the evening sky, peace settled deep into the earth, quiet, enduring, and complete. The golden amber light of the Judean evening poured across the flat rooftops of Jericho, washing over the parched mud brick walls and painting the dusty palm fronds in shades of bruised copper and softest rose. Out in the courtyards, the fierce, breathless heat of the desert afternoon finally began to yield, replaced by a gentle, cooling breeze that rustled the heavy green leaves of the sycamore trees lining the central avenue. The city, which had buzzed all day with the frantic, noisy energy of 1,000 Passover pilgrims and the sharp, clinking friction of Roman coin, now breathed a long, contented sigh. The streets grew quiet. The shouting merchants packed away their wares, folding up their canvas awnings and sweeping the spilled grain from their thresholds. Inside the large, colonnaded courtyard of Zacchaeus' estate, the air was sweet with the fragrance of crushed mint, damp stone, and the rich, earthy scent of roasting lamb and seasoned lentils drifting from the kitchens. For years, this sprawling home had been a silent monument to isolation, a fortress of limestone and polished cedar built behind high, forbidding walls, guarded by bolted iron gates and the bitter resentment of an entire town. Every silver denarii that lined its treasury chests had been wrung from the sweat and desperation of neighbors, collected under the watchful, terrifying eye of the imperial eagle. But tonight, the heavy oak doors stood wide open to the night air. The lanterns hanging from the pomegranate boughs cast a warm, flickering glow over tables laden with bread, fresh figs, roasted fish, and sweet red wine, sharing bounty where hoarding had once reigned. At the center of it all sat Jesus of Nazareth, leaning back against a cushioned wooden bench with an ease that seemed to quiet the very air around him. His woolen tunic, travel-stained and dusty from the long ascent up from the Jordan Valley, was rumpled, and the calloused hands resting upon his knees bore the quiet marks of a carpenter's labor. Yet there was an unhurried majesty in his posture, a deep, abiding stillness that radiated from his presence like the warmth of a hearth fire long after the flames had settled into glowing coals. Around him, guests from the margins of Jericho, men and women whose names were never spoken in polite company, the poor, the weary, the overlooked, spoke in low, murmuring tones of gratitude and wonder. They passed the bread from hand to hand, their shoulders no longer hunched against the expected blow of public scorn. Across the low cedar table sat Zacchaeus. The fine, imported linen of his tunic, usually stiff and immaculate to project an aura of untouchable authority, was discarded. In its place, he wore a simple, unadorned garment of undyed wool, soft and comfortable against his skin. The heavy, gold-embossed signet ring that had so often flashed in the sunlight as he pointed to the tax registers now rested quietly in a small bronze bowl near the doorway, abandoned along with the ledgers and the weighing scales. His short stature, which had once been a source of such bitter, defensive pride and stinging humiliation, no longer seemed to matter. He was no longer looking down at others from a height of manufactured superiority, nor was he straining on his tiptoes to peer over the shoulders of a hostile crowd. He was simply sitting, present and unmasked, in the company of a teacher who had looked straight up into the tangled branches of a roadside tree and called him by name. The memory of that afternoon moment still hung in the air like a sweet, lingering mist. Zacchaeus could still feel the sudden, arresting weight of those compassionate eyes that held no condemnation, no mockery for the grown man perched awkwardly in the foliage like an overgrown boy, but only a vast, fathomless understanding. Jesus had not asked for his resume. He had not demanded an account of the stolen silver or a justification for the empty seats at the tax booth. He had simply looked into the bruised corners of a lonely heart and said that he must stay at his house today. And in that single, unmerited invitation, the rigid walls of Zacchaeus' life had simply crumbled away, leaving behind the fertile ground of a completely remade spirit. A soft ripple of laughter drifted from the far end of the courtyard, where an elderly widow was recounting to a young fisherman how the chief tax collector had practically tumbled out of the sycamore tree when the invitation was given. Zacchaeus smiled, a genuine, self-deprecating warmth spreading across his features, lines of tension that had carved themselves deep around his eyes over decades of suspicion finally smoothing away. He did not mind the gentle mirth. For the first time in his memory, he was part of the circle rather than the shadow cast outside it. Jesus turned his head, his dark, luminous eyes meeting Zacchaeus' gaze across the low-burning lamp between them. There was no need for grand speeches now. The transactions of the heart had already been settled under the late afternoon sun, measured not in the cold arithmetic of Roman currency, but in the radical, overflowing currency of grace. "The ground is fertile here," Jesus said quietly, his voice a low, resonant melody that seemed to weave itself into the evening shadows. "The seed has fallen where the soil was broken, and the harvest will be rich indeed." Zacchaeus nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat, though the ache behind it was no longer grief, but a profound, overwhelming release. Earlier that evening, standing before the gathered assembly in the courtyard while the sun burned low on the horizon, he had made his public declaration, not under duress, not because of a Roman decree or a religious law, but because the love he had just received made his hoarded wealth look suddenly weightless and grey. Half of all his possessions he was giving to the poor, distributing the silver back to the hands from which it had been wrongfully torn. And if he had defrauded anyone of anything, he was restoring it fourfold, satisfying every debt with a generous, overflowing hand until the ledgers were clean and every ledger of injustice was wiped away. The silver had felt heavy when he hoarded it, pressing down upon his chest like a laden shield against the world. Now, as he watched the distribution lists being drawn up by scribes who were finally working for justice rather than extortion, his hands felt remarkably light. The gold and the coins had not been his life, they had only been a substitute for it. "Lord," Zacchaeus murmured, his voice steady and clear in the gathering dusk, "the chests in the lower chamber are nearly emptied now. The last of the restitution bags will be delivered to the synagogue gates before the dawn breaks. There will be no debt left unpaid in Jericho." Jesus smiled, a slow, radiant expression that seemed to capture the last dying embers of the sunset. "Salvation has come to this house today," he said softly, reaching across the low table to touch the back of Zacchaeus' hand with a brief, warm pressure. "For this man, too, is a son of Abraham. The lost has been found, and what was dead has begun to breathe." The conversation around the table gradually subsided into a peaceful, contented hush. The guests began to rise, one by one, offering quiet blessings and touching Zacchaeus' shoulder with genuine affection as they made their way out through the open courtyard gates. There was no haste in their movements, no anxious glancing over their shoulders at the growing dark. The night was warm, safe, and welcoming. As the last of the visitors departed into the moonlit streets of Jericho, the courtyard grew wonderfully still. Only Jesus and Zacchaeus remained, sitting side by side on the low stone bench beneath the trembling, silver-dusted leaves of the pomegranates. The silence between them was not the awkward quiet of strangers, but the deep, restful communion of two souls attuned to the quiet rhythm of the universe. Above them, the Judean night sky blossomed into a vast, velvety dome of deepest indigo, sown with countless stars that burned with a steady, diamond-like brilliance in the thin, dry desert air. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of spilled light, majestic and eternal, arching over the flat roofs of the ancient oasis. A faint, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted over the courtyard wall, mingling with the dying fragrance of wood smoke and sun-warm dust. Zacchaeus leaned his head back against the cool stone pillar of the colonnade, looking up past the leaves of the sycamore tree just visible over the parapet. The branches, which had been his hiding place earlier in the day, now stood etched in sharp, dark relief against the starry sky. They no longer looked like a refuge from a hostile world, they looked like a bridge, a clumsy, wonderful place where a lonely man had climbed in desperation and found himself met by grace. His eyelids felt heavy, weighed down not by exhaustion, but by an exquisite, profound peace. The restless vigilance that had kept him awake through countless nights, listening for the sound of approaching mobs or plotting the next day's collection quotas, was gone. His heart beat with a slow, regular cadence, perfectly synchronized with the quiet breathing of the sleeping city around him. Jesus stood up, brushing a stray leaf from his woolen mantle, and looked down at Zacchaeus with a gentle, lingering smile. "Rest well, Zacchaeus," the teacher whispered, turning toward the quiet guest chamber prepared for him near the back of the courtyard. "The morning will bring its own road, but tonight belongs to peace." "Rest well, Master," Zacchaeus replied softly, watching as the tall figure moved gracefully into the shadows of the colonnade, disappearing into the warm, quiet dark. Zacchaeus remained on the bench for a long moment, watching the stars wheel slowly across the vast expanse of the midnight sky. He did not move. He did not need to calculate, or defend, or prove anything to anyone ever again. The ledger was clear. The accounts were settled. The isolation that had frozen his soul for a lifetime had melted away beneath the warm, penetrating gaze of unmerited love. Slowly, deliberately, he stretched out his legs upon the smooth mosaic stones of the courtyard floor, letting his arms rest limply at his sides. The rough wool of his tunic brushed against the cool tile. The night air moved over his face like a cool hand smoothing away the last remaining traces of a long, difficult day. Far off in the distance, beyond the palm groves and the ancient stone walls, a solitary desert owl hooted once, a low, melodic sound that dissolved harmlessly into the vast, silent sea of the night. The palm fronds whispered against one another in the faint midnight draft, a soft, dry swishing sound like silk sliding over stone. Zacchaeus closed his eyes. The tension in his shoulders melted completely away, flowing down into the earth like water sinking into parched sand. There was no tomorrow yet to fear, no yesterday left to regret. There was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of his own breathing, the cool touch of the night breeze, and the vast, beautiful quiet of a world held safely beneath the stars. The oasis city of Jericho settled deeper into its slumber, wrapped in a blanket of absolute stillness. The dust of the marketplace lay undisturbed in the silver moonlight. The ancient sycamore tree stood tall and steadfast beside the quiet road, its leaves resting motionless in the tranquil air, guarding the deep, enduring peace that had finally found a home within these ancient walls. Everything was still. Everything was complete. And the night stretched out endlessly, wonderfully quiet, carrying all things into a deep and untroubled rest. The morning sun rose over the mountains of Moab not with a sudden blaze, but with a slow, amber diffusion that crept across the Judean wilderness, turning the limestone cliffs from pale ash to burnished copper. Long before the bustling markets of Jericho began to stir with the rattle of iron scales and the sharp bartering of merchants, a profound and lingering stillness held the courtyard of Zacchaeus. The cool shadows of the night still pooled beneath the deep porticos of the stone house, where Tamar, the head housekeeper, moved with a quiet, practiced grace, sweeping the flagstones with a palm frond broom. Every movement she made was measured, as if she feared disturbing the delicate, invisible shift that had settled over the estate the evening before, a transformation that had little to do with the polished bronze lamps or the newly scrubbed floors, and everything to do with the master of the house who now stood upon the flat rooftop, looking out toward the shimmering ribbon of the Jordan Valley. Zacchaeus wore no heavy gold rings this morning, nor the stiff, brilliantly dyed purple mantle that usually announced his official capacity as the chief tax collector of the district. Instead, he was draped in a simple tunic of undyed linen, the coarse fabric falling softly against shoulders that felt, for the first time in decades, entirely unburdened of an invisible weight. Below him, the awakening city began to exhale its familiar morning breath, the acrid scent of burning olive wood from 100 breakfast hearths, the pungent aroma of drying balsam and roasting cumin, and the distant, muffled bray of packed donkeys waiting at the city gates. The great sycamore tree, rooted just beyond the low courtyard wall, caught the very first rays of golden light upon its sprawling canopy, its broad leaves trembling slightly in a gentle thermal draft rising from the Dead Sea basin. Simeon, the burly toll guard who had spent the better part of his life enforcing the Roman tariff with a hardened scowl, sat upon a stone bench near the outer gate, paring an apple with a small bronze knife. His movements lacked their usual aggressive snap. Instead, he periodically glanced up toward the rooftop where Zacchaeus stood, his brow furrowed in a mixture of lingering bewilderment and reluctant awe. Only hours before, the courtyard had echoed with the hurried accounting of ledgers, the weighing of silver denarii, and the anxious whispers of debtors whose lives were bound to the whim of the chief publican. Now, those heavy leather ledgers lay stacked upon a cedar table, marked with broad strokes of fresh ink that spelled out restitution fourfold, a sweeping erasure of accounts that had left Simeon's head spinning. "The bakers are setting out the morning loaves," Simeon called out softly, his deep voice carrying easily through the crisp morning air as he looked up toward the rooftop. "And the caravan from Petra has already cleared the lower checkpoint without incident, though young Marcus is grumbling about the missing manifest." Zacchaeus turned slowly, his eyes reflecting the pale gold of the morning sky. There was a remarkable clarity in his gaze, an absence of the darting, defensive suspicion that had once characterized every interaction he had with the townsfolk of Jericho. He rested his hands upon the cool stone parapet, feeling the ancient grain of the masonry beneath his palms. "Let Marcus handle the manifest according to the new measure," Zacchaeus replied, his voice calm and steady, possessing a newfound resonance that seemed to fill the open space. "There is no need for old encumbrances today, Simeon. The baskets of grain and the measures of oil we set aside at dawn, have they been sent to the quarter near the lower cistern?" Abigail saw to it herself before the sun cleared the ridge, Simeon answered, rising from the bench and brushing a few crumbs from his heavy wool tunic. He hesitated for a moment, the knife still gripped in his large, calloused hand, before taking a slow step toward the exterior stone staircase. The widows in that lane, they did not know what to make of it. They thought it was another Levi, another clever accounting trick designed to extract a hidden tax. When Abigail told them it was a gift, a return of what was wrongfully doubled, one old woman sat in the dust and wept until her shawl was soaked. Zacchaeus listened, not with the detached indifference of a magistrate receiving a report, but with a deep, piercing attentiveness that seemed to gather every word into his heart. He remembered the look in the eyes of Jesus of Nazareth the afternoon before, eyes that had bypassed the contempt of the crowd, bypassed the gilded robes and the moral righteousness of the religious elite, to rest upon him with a love so fierce and unmerited it had cracked his well-guarded soul wide open. It was a gaze that demanded nothing yet changed everything, inviting him out of the lonely branches of his self-imposed isolation and down into the messy, beautiful reality of shared human existence. "Go down and tell Abigail to prepare the large courtyard," Zacchaeus instructed, turning away from the parapet and walking toward the shaded stairway. Not for dignitaries, nor for Roman officials seeking favors, but for anyone from the market who wishes to share bread. Open the heavy iron gates wide. Let the dust of the street blow across the threshold if it must. We have spent far too many years keeping the world outside. As Zacchaeus descended the stone steps into the cool, sun-dappled interior of the house, the atmosphere shifted with him. The dark cedar beams of the ceiling seemed less oppressive, catching the morning light that poured through the central courtyard opening, illuminating the dancing motes of dust in long, golden shafts. Tamar was already busy arranging low wooden tables and spreading bright, coarsely woven kilims across the stone floor, rugs of crimson and indigo that had long remained folded away in cedar chests, preserved for guests who never came because the master of the house had been deemed unclean by the pious standards of the day. The transition from the quiet seclusion of the night to the awakening life of the city was not a jarring interruption, but a natural unfolding, like the petals of a desert lily opening to the dew. In the narrow, winding lanes outside, the inhabitants of Jericho were beginning to notice the unusual quietude of the toll house. For years, the heavy oak doors had been bolted against the jeers of passers-by, opened only to admit trembling debtors or Roman soldiers clanking with armor. Now, as the morning sun climbed higher into the cloudless blue vault of heaven, the massive gate stood unlatched, swinging slightly on well-oiled hinges with every gentle breath of wind from the Judean hills. Abigail, moving with quiet efficiency between the pantry and the central court, paused by the doorway as Zacchaeus approached. Her face, lined with the quiet dignity of years spent serving in a household touched by both great wealth and profound sorrow, held a soft, untroubled expression. "The oil is fresh," and the baker sent double the usual measure of barley cakes when he heard for whom they were intended, Abigail said, her voice dropping to a warm register as she adjusted the folds of her head covering. "He asked no questions, Master." But there was a strange wonder in his voice, as if he could hardly believe the scent of wood smoke coming from our hearth could mean peace rather than penalty. "It is a new day, Abigail," Zacchaeus said softly, stopping beside her and placing a hand briefly upon her shoulder, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude that crossed the old boundaries of master and servant. "The accounts are balanced, not by the harsh weight of the law, but by the abundance of grace. Let us make sure no one is turned away from the door." Outside, the heavy scent of blooming oleander and wild mint drifted over the mud brick walls from the nearby irrigation channels, carried on the steady morning breeze that blew up from the Jordan Valley. Pilgrims on their way toward Jerusalem still crowded the main thoroughfares, their sandals kicking up fine clouds of white limestone dust that shimmered in the slantwise sunbeams. Among them, small groups paused near the open gates of the tax collector's estate, whispering among themselves, casting cautious glances into the sunlit courtyard where tables were being laid with simple earthenware pitchers of cool water and baskets of sun-ripened figs. Simeon stood near the entrance, his broad arms crossed over his chest, no longer glaring at the passers-by with a posture of intimidation, but offering a quiet, hesitant nod to those who caught his eye. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to the hurried traveler, but it signaled a seismic shift in the life of Jericho. The iron grip of extortion was loosening, replaced by the strange, disarming warmth of restitution and radical hospitality. Zacchaeus walked toward the great sycamore tree that loomed just outside the courtyard wall, its massive trunk deeply grooved and weathered by centuries of desert sun and flash floods. He placed his hand upon its rough bark, feeling the stubborn strength of the wood that had sustained him through his darkest hour of desperate longing. The leaves above whispered softly in the morning air, catching the light and scattering bright, dappled patterns across the dusty earth below. Here, suspended between earth and sky, he had found his rescue. Here, amidst the ordinary clutter of daily life, the extraordinary had broken into his world and made all things new. The morning breeze drifted down from the Judean hills, carrying the scent of wild hyssop and sunbaked dust across the rooftops of Jericho, sweeping gently through the sprawling branches of the ancient sycamore tree. Long after the momentous footsteps of Jesus and his disciples had faded down the dusty southern road toward Jerusalem, a profound and lingering hush settled over the courtyard of Zacchaeus' estate. Tamar, the longtime housekeeper whose eyes had witnessed decades of guarded isolation and bitter resentment, stood near the arched stone doorway with a rolled woolen cloth in her hands, watching her master with a wonder that bordered on disbelief. The heavy cedar gates, which had remained firmly bolted against the murmuring crowds and the desperate pleas of impoverished neighbors for as many years as anyone cared to remember, now swung wide open on their oiled hinges, inviting the gentle morning light and the hesitant, curious glances of passers-by into the sun-drenched courtyard. Zacchaeus turned away from the rough bark of the sycamore tree, his fingers lingering for a final moment on the deep grooves where his sandals had scraped the wood in frantic, undignified haste only hours before. He felt lighter, as though an invisible weight of iron and lead, forged from years of accumulated coin, stolen trust, and self-inflicted exile, had been lifted entirely from his shoulders, leaving him strangely vulnerable yet infinitely strong. Simeon, the burly toll guard whose broad shoulders and heavy fists had once served as the primary instruments of Zacchaeus's ruthless taxation, walked slowly across the paved stones, holding a leather ledger bound with cracked straps of camel hide. Simeon's face, usually set in a permanent scowl intended to intimidate the local merchants and caravan drivers, wore an expression of bewildered hesitation. "Master," Simeon began, his deep voice carrying a rare tremor of uncertainty as he extended the heavy ledger toward the chief tax collector. "The caravan masters from the Nabatean trade route have not yet cleared the lower station. With the new decree you just whispered to the crowd, promising fourfold restitution to anyone defrauded, what shall we record in the books for the incoming tolls?" Zacchaeus looked down at the dark leather-bound volume that had dictated every waking hour of his adult life, a book filled with columns of figures, names of debtors, and calculations of extracted wealth that had measured his worth in silver denarii. He reached out, not with the greedy, clutching gesture with which he had once snatched every available coin, but with a steady, open hand, taking the ledger and holding it as one might hold a harmless, burnt-out torch. "Burn it, Simeon," Zacchaeus said softly, his voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that brooked no argument. "Or better yet, use the blank parchment to write down the names of every widow, every orphan, and every struggling farmer in the lower district who ever lost their livelihood to our scales. We are no longer keeping account of what is owed to us. We are opening an account of what we owe to them." Simeon stared at his master, the magnitude of the command sinking slowly into his hardened mind, and for the first time in all their years of service, a slow, genuine smile broke across the guard's weathered face. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture of absolute loyalty, and tucked the ledger under his arm with a newfound sense of purpose, turning toward the stone-lined hearth where the household coals still smoldered from the morning meal. Inside the sprawling whitewashed villa, the air was cool and fragrant with the lingering scent of crushed mint and roasted bread from the meal shared with Jesus and his followers. Abigail of Jericho, whose husband's vineyard had nearly been seized during the previous year's drought before Zacchaeus's sudden intervention, moved quietly through the pillared hallways, helping Tamar arrange ceramic pitchers and woven baskets filled with fresh figs and dates that Zacchaeus had ordered distributed freely to anyone who entered the gates. The atmosphere of the house had transformed completely. The oppressive silence that once hung behind the shuttered windows had vanished, replaced by the gentle hum of purposeful activity and the soft murmur of astonished voices from neighbors who had finally dared to step across the threshold. Zacchaeus walked through the portico and out into the wider streets of Jericho, stepping away from the sanctuary of his home to re-enter the bustling civic life from which he had voluntarily excommunicated himself. The city of palms was alive with the vibrant, chaotic energy of the ancient Near East, merchants shouting prices of dried dates and balsam oils, children darting between the legs of laden pack mules, and Roman legionaries in polished bronze breastplates patrolling the paved thoroughfares near the grand theatre Herod had built against the base of the mountains. As Zacchaeus walked down the familiar alleyways, he noticed how the reactions of the townspeople had shifted from the usual sharp turns of averted eyes and bitter underbreath curses. When a local potter, a man named Eli whose taxes Zacchaeus had artificially inflated during the spring barley harvest, stepped out from his workshop with a stack of unglazed clay jars, he froze upon seeing the chief tax collector approach. Instinctively, Eli braced himself, his hands tightening around the rim of a water pitcher as though expecting another demand for coin. Zacchaeus stopped just a few paces away, removing his fine linen head covering in a gesture of profound humility that stunned the artisan into absolute silence. "Eli," Zacchaeus said, his voice steady and clear against the background din of the marketplace. "The spring assessment for your workshop was unjust. My men have the exact figures of the excess silver, and before the sun sets today, for times that amount will be delivered directly to your workbench, along with enough seed grain to see your family through the next planting season." Eli blinked rapidly, the color draining from his face before rushing back in a warm flood of disbelief. He looked into Zacchaeus' eyes and found no trace of the mocking arrogance or cold calculation that had defined their past encounters, only a deep, luminous peace and an unshakable sincerity. The potter's lower lip trembled, and slowly, without a word, he set the clay jar down upon the dusty earth, stepped forward, and placed a calloused hand upon Zacchaeus' forearm in a gesture of reconciliation that bridged a chasm of years. News of the unfolding events rippled through the sun-drenched alleys like wildfire, drawing whispers of amazement from the spice sellers, the weavers, and the caravan guards resting in the shadow of the monumental stone walls. This was not merely a change of heart, it was an earthquake in the moral landscape of Jericho, a city accustomed to the unyielding tyranny of Roman taxation and the bitter compromises of those who collaborated with the empire. Later that afternoon, as the shadows lengthened across the desert floor and cast long, cool fingers over the western facade of the city, Zacchaeus climbed the stone steps that led to the flat rooftop of his villa. From this elevated vantage point, he could see the vast expanse of the Jordan Valley stretching out toward the shimmering, slate-blue surface of the Dead Sea far to the south, bordered by the dense green emeralds of the famous balsam groves that made Jericho the jewel of the desert. The heat of the day was finally breaking, replaced by the refreshing desert draft that rushed down from the Judean wilderness. Zacchaeus leaned against the parapet, gazing out toward the dusty road that wound its way upward through the barren, jagged hills toward Jerusalem, the road where Jesus was now walking, heading steadily toward the climax of his earthly mission. Every step the Nazarene took carried him closer to the looming shadow of the capital, closer to the profound sacrifice that Zacchaeus was only now beginning to comprehend in all its agonizing, beautiful depth. The chief tax collector placed his hands on the cool stone of the parapet, feeling the steady rhythm of his own heart beating against the quiet evening air. He was no longer the isolated man in the sycamore tree, desperate for a fleeting glimpse of a passing prophet. He was a man restored, brought back from the cold margins of human society into the warmth of divine belonging, charged with a new vocation of radical generosity and relentless grace that would echo through the streets of Jericho for the rest of his days. The sun dipped below the jagged western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of bruised violet, fiery amber, and soft rose, while the great sycamore tree below stood sentinel in the gathering dusk, its rustling leaves singing a quiet evening lullaby to a city forever changed. Inside the softly lit courtyard, Tamar carefully extinguished the flickering clay oil lamps, her hands moving with a newfound gentleness that mirrored the profound peace settling over the household. Beyond the heavy wooden gates, the distant murmur of the ancient desert city faded into the cool, star-drenched night, wrapping the whitewashed stone walls in a tranquil, restorative silence. And there we leave it, a story told, a night well spent. Thank you for trusting Easy Drift Sleep with your rest. If these stories bring you comfort, subscribing means we can keep making them for you. Good night. Sleep well.